Victor Shokin. True stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, or who cannot be the President of the United States. Shokin VM. True stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, or who cannot be the President of the USA. Author's journalistic version. Introduction. The arrangement of materials. Texts of VM Shokin in Ukrainian 2020. 248p. Photos of the author from personal archives, from Union, Wikipedia, and open sources were used in this book. This autobiographical book was written by Prosecutor General of Ukraine Victor Shokin, 2015 to 2016, about his professional path and the search for justice. The main part of the book is devoted to the history of the international corruption of U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden in 2014 to 2016, which was investigated by the author of the book. According to the author, the crimes and offenses of a high-ranking U.S. official in Ukraine are primarily related to the activities of his son, Gunter, on the board of directors of the Ukrainian company Burisma. The author also opens the curtain on the political and personal components of the relationship between the President of Ukraine and his closest associates and the Vice President of the United States in the period 2015 to 2016. The book is filled with state and official documents, letters from high-ranking officials, lawsuits, and court decisions proving the position of the author. The vast majority of documents were published for the first time, for a wide range of readers who are interested in Ukrainian politics and international relations. Shokin VM. Author compiler. Text. 2020. Shokin VM. Photo. This book is dedicated to the Ukrainian and American people whom I respect and sincerely love. Peace, goodness, and happiness to both of them. This book is also dedicated to my eldest daughter, Alina, a U.S. citizen, to the citizens of the United States born in Los Angeles, to my youngest daughter, Veronica Anastasia, granddaughter Daniel, grandson Alexander. Special thanks to the doctors who saved my life. A citizen of independent Ukraine. Victor Shokin. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Victor Shokin in his work cabinet. Preface. I died twice, but God brought me back to life. Forgive me if this book turns out to be tedious. However, if at least somehow it could be useful to understand who is who in nowadays American and Ukrainian politics, then I will be happy, so pray for me. I would like to emphasize at once that I am not a politician, and that this book does not pursue any political goals, but it has a purely legal basis. I started my career in the prosecutor's office in 1980. There reigned an era in Soviet Union, which was later called stagnation. Grandiose political and social changes were occurring, Gorbachev's perestroika, publicity, and then the coup, the collapse of the USSR, the independence of my Ukraine. All these will happen later in 5 to 10 years. But then, at the start of my professional career, I, a guy from an ordinary Kyiv family, wanted to change the world for the better, to become a high-class investigator, a knight of the law, to hunt for criminals, to fight injustice. I became an investigator, I became a prosecutor, as well as I became Prosecutor General of Ukraine. I saw evil face to face, and that is why I know that human strength is forefront in the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, confrontation of injustice and crime. This struggle is not just difficult always, it is extremely difficult. I am deeply convinced that in 2016, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden illegally, and for his own corrupt purposes, succeeded in dismissing me from the post of Attorney General using the blackmailing of the President of my belligerent country by refusing to release $1 billion in aid to my warring Ukraine. It was more than humiliating for my homeland. Biden was so afraid of continuing to investigate the Burisma case that he involved many members of President Barack Obama's administration into international corruption. According to the words of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, the entire Obama administration has been working on the resignation of Prosecutor General of Ukraine. As Secretary of State, I have been deeply immersed in this issue. Everyone in our administration wanted the prosecutor's resignation. From Obama to the Secretary of State, everyone has been working on it, also an ambassador. I did not want to submit silently to such injustice. Then it was decided to remove me, not only from office, but also physically. I do not doubt that Joe Biden is behind this. On the verge of death, when an excess of mercury was found in my body 5 times more than allowed. When my heart stopped twice, and it is only thanks to the Greek and Austrian doctors I survived, just then I promised myself again that I will do my best to punish evil and restore justice. For the sake of justice and the future of our children and grandchildren. Also for my children and grandchildren, Ukrainian and American. I became even stronger on the path of struggle. Pray for me if you can. Yes, I suspect Joe Biden to be involved in an assassination attempt on my life. I accuse Joe Biden of blackmail at the interstate level and interfering in the internal affairs of Ukraine. The President of Ukraine has told me many times about the pressure which $1 billion can create. Realizing that the interests of the state, which at the time was in dire need of donor funds, were higher than my own, I was forced to resign. Although I had the desire to work and the obligation to complete the investigations of many high-profile cases. Yes, I accused Joe Biden of using his high position for his own selfish purposes, covering the private Ukrainian corrupted company Burisma, where he hired his son Gunter to work for big money, or rather to cover up the activities of its. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Owner Mykola Zlochevsky. The Vice President of USA, Joseph Biden, had to remove me from the post of Prosecutor General of Ukraine in order to close the criminal cases against Burisma. He was more interested in the depths of my homeland and its natural resources than in his desire to help Ukraine build democracy and be integrated into the civilized Western European world. Joe Biden and his accomplices, who made money here by corruption, by feeding local dishonest government officials, were indifferent to the fact that their actions deliberately increased the degree of military confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. They sowed new political corruption in Ukraine on an unprecedented scale, which hindered the development of my country. Me, as a former Prosecutor General of Ukraine, have my own opinion and confirmation of how Joe Biden and his encirclement made money from corruption in Ukraine. At the same time, I still believe that the Democratic Party of the United States has been misled and has not fully realized who this politician really is and what reputational damage he has done to it. In my struggle, I strive to achieve 3 goals that will probably benefit Ukraine and the United States. First of all, I want to restore justice and prove in court that I was fired in 2016 by Joseph Biden, who was vice president of USA at that time, and who wanted to stop investigating criminal cases against the Ukrainian company Burisma, where his son Gunter was a member. Secondly, I want to return to the post of Prosecutor General of Ukraine to complete the investigation of the Maidan case and the crimes of the Yanukovych family and his associates. I am convinced that the country will not be able to develop normally without receiving answers. Who killed people on the Maidan, and who gave such an order? The heavenly 100 people killed during Euromaidan were shooted is a great tragedy not only for the families of the victims, but also of the modern history of the entire Ukrainian people. I have my own version of the case investigation regarding the death of journalist Pavel Sheremet, who was killed in 2016. I'm sure it is still possible to identify the perpetrators and organizers of this crime, and I think this case is related to the murder of another journalist in 2000s, Georgi Gongadze, whose killers were found by an investigative team led by me, although the actual killers were. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine punished. The case is not over, as the perpetrators who ordered this high-profile crime have not yet been identified. Third, there are several investigations I have launched involving international corruption in Ukraine, which I consider an honor to complete. First of all, I'm talking about the Burisma case, as well as the case of the embezzled funds of USA taxpayers, in particular for the new reform of the prosecutor's office and law enforcement agencies of Ukraine. The cost more than $7 million in the years 2014 to 2016. I believe that justice will be restored. My book is about that. But first, I suggest to return to 2015 to 2016 and even earlier. Chapter 1. From the Investigator to Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Viktor Shokin, investigator on especially important cases of the Kyiv Prosecutor's Office, 1988. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. The whole story of my life leads to the fact that I have to dig for the true facts, find the truth according to the law, and hunt down criminals. This is, if you like, a professional habit. I have held various positions in the prosecutor's office, including 3 times as Deputy to Prosecutor General of Ukraine under different presidents, and finally in 2015 to 2016 as Prosecutor General of Ukraine. But my life calling was always to be as an investigator. I was born in Kyiv on November 4th, 1952, in a simple family. My mother worked on the railway. My father was a veteran, a medalist. He was a Viktor Shokin, first row in the center near the house by the Polovetska Street, 1957, communications fitter at the Kyiv telephone station. We lived very modestly in a small 9 square meters room in a barrack on Polovetska Street. When Khrushchev declared war to the barracks and people began to live with certain household amenities, our family was given a room in a communal house on 12 Saksaganskoho Street. I still remember our phone number, B. Despite the well-established ideas about everyday difficulties in communal housing, in our apartment, N54, there lived happily together 5 Jewish families and 1 Ukrainian, my family. So 6 bells on the entrance, 6 light switches on the wall near the bath and toilet, 6 stoves in the kitchen. When I was 15, my parents moved to another apartment, but I stayed since the school I had attended for 10 years was located nearby. I will never forget how anxious my neighbors were. The Leibovitz, the Wassermans, the old Hermit Rosenberg, the Aunt Ida. It seemed to them that I was constantly malnourished, so everyone tried to feed me. They taught me a lot about life, and I inherited my humanity from them. By the way, most of my schoolmates are also Jews. Lenya Rosenwasser, with whom I sat at the same desk, and Volodya Yuk, whom I pulled up with in mathematics. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Viktor Shokin, a student of the Kyiv's 10-year school, 1967. In short, my childhood and youth were spent in the Jewish community of Kyiv. It was the life experience that everyone needs at the beginning of life. After school, my mother insisted that I enter the Kyiv Agricultural Academy, the Faculty of Forestry. I entered, however, the future of the forester did not fire within, so with greater passion I indulged in sports, athletics. I was fond of sprinting. Unfortunately, one fateful day during my second year whilst preparing for competition, I injured my leg. It was quite compatible with everyday life and moderate activities, but completely incompatible. Chapter 1. From the Investigator to Prosecutor General of Ukraine. With Mom, 1950s, 21. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Viktor Shokin with parents, 1995, for competitive sports. This injury was a turning point in my life. I left the Faculty of Forestry and joined the Army, and when I returned, I entered the Kharkiv Law Institute. I followed the dream. I was led by Life Call. Straight after graduating from the institute, I worked for 8 years as an investigator in the prosecutor's office of the Moscow district in Kyiv. Then, 6 years as a weightlifter, professional slang given to investigators on particularly important cases in the city prosecutor's office. I was involved in the most complicated cases: murders, robberies, rapes, bribery. It was difficult, but it was a work based on law and justice, and today I feel nostalgia for this approach to work, for those times of youth, for such dedication. It was the year 1994 that the special units were set up at all regional and city prosecutors' offices in Ukraine to oversee compliance with the law by Security Service of Ukraine and organized crime control officers. A GAEAEA designed, amongst other things, to detect top-level corruption. I was appointed as head of the first newly created department in Kyiv. This horizontally built institution had become completely independent. Each department needed its own seal, a separate bank account, and separate premises away from the prosecutor's office. and dismissed with the consent of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. I must say that I came to this position with a bag full of successfully investigated cases, among which there were several high-profile ones, the most prominent being the case of the White Brotherhood, an esoteric sect of a totalitarian nature. Younger readers have probably heard only an echo of this story, which thundered in 1992 to 1994, throughout Ukraine and abroad, hundreds of. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Thousands of people had come under the influence of two manipulators of mass consciousness, Yuri Krivonikov and Marina Tsvigun. To escape the apocalypse, predicted by White Brotherhood ideologists, people abandoned their families and donated their money, apartments, and other property to this sect. In November 1993, sectarians seized Sofia of Kyiv and planned to burn themselves. Krivonikov and Tsvigun were arrested by police. I remember that during the interrogations, the defendant demanded that she had be named not as Marina, but only by her ritual name, Mary Devi Christ. It seems to me that this beautiful woman, under the influence of her mentor's suggestions, sincerely believed in her divine mission, and in fact thought she was the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary. When the teenagers from the White Brotherhood went on a hunger strike demanding that Tsvigun be released from the pre-trial detention center, I managed to persuade her to appeal to the hunger strikers and stop this senseless action. We investigated the White Brotherhood case quickly and brought it to court. Many adherents of the sect were found being suffering from mental disorders, but Tsvigun in herself was found to be sane. She was given 4 years imprisonment, Krivonikov 6. They have served their terms. In 1998, I started my work in the Prosecutor's General Office as an investigator in particularly important matters. The most difficult, both in terms of time and volume, I would have to name the case of the Gromov's gang, which operated in Zaporizhia City, as well as in western Ukraine and Rostov in Russia. There were 16 murders and about 70 robberies on the gang's account, including banking institutions and so on. I lived in Zaporizhia for almost 3 years. This is a case I am still proud of. There were 17 people, thugs, who received long sentences, 3 of them, including Gromov, life imprisonment. And I finally returned to Kyiv and with a clear conscience went to the management to ask for the first vacation in 3 years. They gave me 30 days, though I had hoped for more. However, I was pulled out on vacation on the 3rd day. Mykola Obikod, who was the deputy general at that time, said, "Victor, I'm sorry, but we have to." The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Work. Go to the Dnipro. There is a case against Yulia Tymoshenko. It concerned United Energy Systems of Ukraine. This was a surprise to me because I was not at all familiar with this case, which, as I knew, had been an ongoing investigation for 3 years already. Nevertheless, what can you do? So I went on a business trip to the Dnipro. At this time, the city was still called Dnipropetrovsk. The case was undertaken on a grand scale, as if it promised to be the biggest case of the century, more than 24 important people of the GPU and about 100 investigators plus security. All these people occupied half of the Star Hotel on the banks of the Dnieper, where for some reason the headquarters were located. Investigators lived there for years. Coincidentally, my classmate was the chief of that staff. I showed my interest asking him in a friendly way, "So, what did you find?" "Come on, read it yourself," he says, and brings me 3 volumes. I flipped through. There was only general information, so essentially empty. So where's the case? I was surprised. Then a friend took me to another room, where on the floor, against a wall, there were rows of sacks. Yes, the same bags in which peasants store potatoes. There were about 15 of them. I opened one, and the next, etc. All the bags were filled with crumpled papers. "Go through all these," they told me. "Now you are in charge here." I loaded the car and went back to Kiev, straight to Obihud, Mykola Serhiovich. I think there is no case there. I cannot undertake such a job. Mykola Obihud directly stated that if I refused, Prosecutor General Podobenko would fire me. Well, I wrote that parting letter myself and left the GPU. In 2002, I was offered the position of Deputy to Prosecutor General of Ukraine for investigation to prosecute. I know that my appointment was demanded by the Democratic opposition at the time. At the end of October 2004, the Maidan gathered in Kyiv, which grew into the Orange Revolution. Ukrainians went to the streets to protest against the falsification of the election results in favor of the presidential candidate from the Party of Regions, Viktor Yanukovych. Petro Poroshenko joined the Oranges. After Viktor Yanukovych managed to win and become the head of the country, Poroshenko was appointed Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. One of the promises of the Orange Revolution was the promise: bandits to prisons. I remember after Maidan 2004, Petro Poroshenko, with whom I had known for several. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Years already tried to dissuade me from investigating the so-called White Swan case, in which the main defendant was Boris Kolesnikov, the head of Donetsk Regional Council, very influential in the Party of Regions. "Do you even understand that you bought a ticket to the war?" Poroshenko prophesied. I replied that everything was legal. There were grounds for his arrest. In addition, of course, I was aware of the danger. I understood that I could be eliminated, or using professional slang, crashed. I was not crashed, only fired, and a criminal case against me was opened. Interrogations, face-to-face threats of arrest. But in the end, I was left alone. However, the main case of the 2000s, which I was not allowed to complete, was the case of the death of Gongadze. The journalist's body was found in November 2000s, but the investigation did not actually move for almost 2 years. I think there were people in the GPU and in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who preferred that the facts surrounding the murder of this journalist, which caused a great political storm, was never brought to light, and the case never solved. I came as Deputy of Prosecutor General on July 10, 2002, and a day later I convened a meeting concerning the Gongadze case. Such meetings were held daily at 8 o'clock in the evening in my office, and by the end of the summer we already knew the names of all 4 participants in the killing, including a senior police official, Alexei Pukach, a head of Criminal Investigation Department in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. At the time of the crime, he headed the Department of External Oversight of MIA, referred as Outside. So our investigators had to go through all the circles of hell just to get the documents of Outside. We knew that Alexei Pukac had organized the assassination of Georgy Gongadze, but we did not have sufficient evidence that could be presented in court. Therefore, in 2003, Pukac was arrested for the destruction of secret documents that testified to the surveillance of the journalist. He burned part of these documents to hide the traces of the murder. Alexei Pukac spent 4 months in a pre-trial detention center. The command had come, and the murderer was released on bail under surveillance. Of course, he escaped, and we all were fired from the GPU, together with Sviatoslav Piskun, who was prosecutor general at that time. Actually, he was not relevant directly to the investigation of this case. The investigation has stopped. When I returned to the Prosecutor General's office in 2005, I reopened this investigation by assembling the same team. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Viktor Shokin, Deputy Prosecutor General of Ukraine, 2005. Security Service of Ukraine, SSU, began to compete with us, and I must say, this hindered our progress very much. That was the SSU, which was headed by Alexander Turchinov after the Orange Revolution. He was sure, for some reason, that Alexei Pukac was hiding in Israel. The basis of this idea is unknown. On the contrary, I felt intuitively that the killer of Gongadze did not go abroad, but lay low somewhere here in Ukraine. Then, in 2005, Turchinov sent a group to Israel to arrest Pukac. Andriy Koshemyakin led this group. I warned him that it was necessary to draw up all the relevant documents, without which no one in Israel would receive this group. Neither the Mossad, nor the prosecutor's office, nor other law enforcement and special services. But my warnings were ignored. Koshemyakin's group stayed in Israel for a week, and no one had been willing to accept them. Eventually, they asked for documents from the GPU, and they stayed for a few more weeks. Of course, it was government money, but returned with nothing. After all, Pukac was not in Israel. My intuition that the killer had not run from Ukraine were not confirmed until 2009, when Pukac was found in an isolated village in the middle of a forest in the Zhytomyr region. Thus, he is now imprisoned. The true story is about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. However, Gongadze's case is not over. The main thing left is to expose the customer who still lives quietly in Ukraine. I have a personal opinion about this customer. I hope that fate will give me the opportunity to return to the position from where I was illegally dismissed and to put an end to the investigation, which has been ongoing for 2 decades already. In my opinion, the Gongadze case is related to the case about Sharamet. I am sure that the customer is the same. When Pavel Sharamet was blown up in a car in July 2016, I replied to reporters who asked me to comment on this assassination attempt. It is worth assembling the same group who led Georgie's case, and they would quickly solve Sharamet's case. I am sure of that even today. Chapter 2, Request for Professionals, Appointment as Prosecutor, General of Ukraine. Viktor Shokin addressed the Verkhovna Rada after deputies voted for his appointment as a Prosecutor General of Ukraine. February 10, 2015. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. After Maidan at the end of June 2014, I was invited to work as the Deputy Prosecutor General of Ukraine. My area of responsibility included overseeing the rule of law by law enforcement agencies, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Security Service of Ukraine, and the Tax Service. Although, of course, I would like to oversee the investigative direction of the GPU. I confess that when the offer to head the Prosecutor's General Office of Ukraine came later, it was a complete surprise to me. I remember one day in early February 2015, Vitaly Yarema, Prosecutor General of Ukraine at that time, phoned and said that the President of Ukraine was waiting for the two of us. We arrived at Bankova. Yarema gave Petro Poroshenko a piece of paper with a report on his resignation of his own volition. Petro Poroshenko immediately signed and said to me, "Viktor Nikolaevich, will you be Prosecutor General?" Later, Vitaly Yarema said that his resignation report included a proposal to appoint me to this position. It is possible. However, I believe that the idea to put me at the head of the GPU belonged to Petro Poroshenko. The fact is that by the beginning of 2015, there was an acute demand for a professional prosecutor general. Post-Maidan units, under the party quota, demonstrated complete failure. And this at a time when our wounded society wanted changes and hoped for justice, in particular, in the investigation of the Maidan and the crimes of Yanukovych and his government officials. Both Oleg Magnitsky, who sat in the chair of Prosecutor General for 3 months under the Svoboda Party's quota, and his successor, Vitaly Yarema, a police general by his career and life credo, were not the ones the GPU needed at the time. I think the president was looking for a professional in his inner circle, but could not find one. Probably the fact that I was the Deputy Prosecutor General 3 times, as well as the fact that Poroshenko knew me well, and that we have known each other for a long time, played a big role in my appointment, as I mentioned. Obviously, my equidistance from politicians of various kinds and ideological colors was also important. Probably my aversion to PR and respect for my real work, concentrating on results, had a certain significance. Later, I realized that there was another hidden reason that apparently prompted Petro, the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, Poroshenko to dismiss Vitaly Yarema and look for another candidate. This fact is related to Burisma. Thus, on February 10, 2015, the president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, submitted to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine a resolution on the removal of Vitaly Yarema from the position of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and the appointment of me to this position. Parliament expressed considerable confidence in me, 318 votes in favor, i.e. more than the constitutional majority. I became Prosecutor General of Ukraine, of the entire Ukrainian people, not of Petro Poroshenko. I openly told this to Peter Alexeyevich, and I testified this speaking from the rostrum of the Verkhovna Rada on the day of my appointment. I think the decisive factor for the deputies who supported my candidacy was that I was not a politician but a professional lawyer, and my whole career showed that I was guided by the law, the interests of Ukraine, and the professional tasks of Prosecutor General's office. I never tried to please either Ukrainian or Western politicians. What was the culture, especially? Draw minus 2,084. Pitting about the cone for sporty to me position of layat. Voting results hashtag 21. Voted for, agreed, against, abstained, 318. Did not vote, totally 382. The decision was made, 1407. 1407. Voting board in the Verkhovna Rada. 318 deputies voted for the appointment of Viktor Shokin as General Prosecutor of Ukraine in the period 2014 to 2019, and unfortunately is still the culture today. I am inclined to work systematically, to uphold the rules of law, to work without unnecessary bravado and fuss, without ego. So, having headed the GPU, I completely concentrated on work and declined the foreign business trips that were fashionable at that time. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine have not made any business trips to the European Union, the United States, or elsewhere. All foreign business trips were worked out by my deputies in profile directions. I have identified several tasks as priorities for myself, Maidan cases, the fight against corruption, and the reform of the prosecutor's office. On the third day after my appointment, I convened a meeting of regional prosecutors and set them the task of investigating corruption crimes in Maidan cases as soon as possible. 4 days after, on February 14th, I held a meeting with people's deputies, the central issue of which was the coordination of efforts to effectively fight corruption. I announced to the regional prosecutors and colleagues in the GPU the introduction of a new style of relations in our department, a new internal prosecutorial ethics. In addition, in the spring of 2015, I initiated the creation of the General Inspectorate, an internal security body whose functions included, in particular, the detection of corruption in the GPU. It was a truly revolutionary, groundbreaking move. In the meantime, we have begun other internal reforms in the Prosecutor General's office, which were to be carried out in accordance with the recommendations of the Venice Commission and Ukraine's commitments to the Council of Europe. On March 6, 2015, I presented a step-by-step strategy for reforming the prosecutor's office. It is about the introduction of prosecutorial self-government, the creation of a council of prosecutors, as well as a qualification and disciplinary commission, into the work of which Prosecutor General had no right to interfere. Indeed, such a case is unprecedented for our system. By the way, when Yuri Lutsenko took the general's chair, he stopped all these bodies of prosecutorial self-government. They are so-called Democrats against democracy in the diversity of their manifestations, including within the prosecutorial system. I organized an open competition for international experts, and thus established the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAP. After the appointment of the head of the SAP, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine was finally able to start working in full. Although I considered then, and consider now, this body unnecessary, as it was artificially imposed on Ukraine by Joseph Biden. However, acting due to the law, we did everything to make Nabu. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine starts working according to its powers. After all, for a long time this body did not fulfill this role, although it had been created formally. Of course, I did not manage to implement all the planned changes in the GPU. In general, the Chief Prosecutor's Office of the country had made significant progress in reform during my years of leadership. I was satisfied with the tempo and direction of improvement. Investigations into high-profile cases, the first being the Maidan case, had also progressed significantly. I was appointed Prosecutor General just a few days before the anniversary of the Maidan shootings. I do not think that this is a coincidence because the authorities had to report on the results of the investigation and there was nothing to report. Personally, as a citizen and as a prosecutor, I wanted to find out what happened on Independence Square on February 18th, 2014, to understand and to find the culprits in this bloodshed. I do not want to say that no investigation was conducted before by the GPU. Storm sabotaged it. The first proceedings were initiated by the main investigation department on February 25th, 2014, a few days after the mass shootings of protesters in the center of Kyiv. Some investigative actions were carried out on Institutska Street, some witnesses were interviewed. However, all this was done chaotically, unfoundedly, and emotionally. The turbulence within the GPU did not help either. Immediately after the Revolution of Dignity, the GPU was headed by a representative of the right-wing forces, Oleg Magnitsky, a man of questionable professional ability and lacking the required experience. Here's just one example of the legacy received from my predecessors. When I asked my deputy, Alexei Baganets, to show a list of officials of Viktor Yanukovych Times, whom Ukraine had submitted to the EU sanctions list, he brought a handwritten sheet. I looked around it and asked, "Is that all? On what grounds are certain people included here? Where is the justification, the reference to the legislation?" It turned out that the list was made quickly, as they say, on a knee or off the cuff. As Alexei Baganets explained to me, Oleg Magnitsky called for him in order to create urgently a list of sanctioned persons who should be submitted to the EU as soon as possible. Alexei remarked that such work takes time. Oleg Magnitsky cut him off. "We have the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. No time. Revolutionary expediency during Robespierre's time replaced law and processes. When I came to office, chaos reigned in the vastness of the proceedings, which named as Maidan affairs. Various cases concerning crimes committed during the Revolution of Dignity were scattered by various units of the GPU. And only in December 2014, a special department was established, headed by Sergei Gorbatyuk. The next day after my appointment, I called Gorbatyuk, asked how many cases we had on the Maidan, and was shocked by his answer, "I don't know." "At least could you say approximately how many? 50, 100,000? He shrugged. "God, a lot." Then I decided to put things in order, weed out proceedings that did not involve the Revolution of Dignity, systematize the rest, compile a register, and seriously undertake an investigation within the entire state. It was fundamental basics for me. I drew a table of what this register should look like. A pyramid was formed, at the top of which stood Viktor Yanukovych, below his entourage, then down the power structures, the Golden Eagle, etc. In my opinion, the register should have covered the whole complex of crimes related to the Revolution of Dignity. Not only the shootings on the Maidan and the sadistic beating of activists in Mariinsky Park, the burning of automated cars, but also the economic crimes of Viktor Yanukovych's family and other government officials. Not only the persecution of activists, but also the killing of Berkut employees. Then I held a video conference with all regional prosecutors in order to collect and organize all proceedings related to Maidan cases. After all, many tragic cases occurred not only in the capital, but elsewhere. In 2 weeks, investigators from Serhiy Horbatyuk's special unit prepared a register, which we published on the GPU's website. We appealed to Ukrainians to testify in one case or another, to provide documents, in particular photos and videos that can help the investigation to tell their stories. In response to the GPU hotline alone, about 500,000 calls were received. Thanks to this feedback, the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine has significantly intensified investigations and opened new proceedings. In total, the Maidan case brought together more than 2,400 cases. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. By the way, by the end of 2015, in all regions of the country, all affairs of the Maidan were completed. Some were transferred to the court or to Serhiy Horbatyuk's office for further systematic investigation, while others were legally decided. On my initiative, we have secured a legislative opportunity to conduct an in absentia investigation. The idea was ripe to seek the possibility of a trial in absentia over them and the fugitive president. In this situation, we had no choice but to go to court in absentia. I preferred that Viktor Yanukovych be tried for the full extent of the disaster caused to the country, without artificially separating economic crimes from others, in particular violations of the Constitution of Ukraine, usurpation of power, and treason. So I organized and directed this work. When Yuri Lutsenko took the chair of Prosecutor General of Ukraine, he destroyed our approaches to work. He artificially separated economic affairs concerning Yanukovych personally from his betrayal of the state. Lutsenko used my initiative on the possibility of a conviction in absentia, and it was legally adopted and implemented. However, Viktor Yanukovych's economic crimes and schemes to plunder a large country have not been fully investigated by either Lutsenko or subsequent general prosecutors. The rulers who plundered the country in 2010 to 2014 were never punished, and their golden loaves, estates, money, economic assets, etc., which arose from the funds stolen from the Ukrainian people, were never returned to the state budget. As for the Maidan cases in general, I had reason to predict that we would be able to complete the main episodes by the end of 2016. However, I was not allowed to finish. I was fired. In preparation for writing this book, I went back 5 years and picked up the GPU statistics for the 12 months I headed it. Of course, this is not the area in which statistics provide in-depth and comprehensive information, but at least they testify to the amount of work conducted. For example, let's look at the number of criminal proceedings on suspicion of corruption. Under Oleg Magnitsky, 219 cases were initiated, 155 of them were sent to court, and only 33 of them were court decisions. Under Vitaly Yerema's leadership, 414. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Proceedings were opened, of which 254 acts were sent to court, and court decisions were made on 59 of them. During my work, 896 criminal cases were initiated, 588 acts were sent to court, 75 court decisions were made. In addition to the above-mentioned work, there was a separate important front, facilitating the release of prisoners, which I started doing in 2014 as Deputy Prosecutor General. We worked together with the SBU. Why was the GPU involved? I will explain it. Our department conducts investigative cases, supervises all other cases that are in the SBU and the Ministry of Internal Affairs, monitors the implementation of court decisions and detentions. The results of the GPU during the leadership of O. Magnitsky, V. Yarema, V. Shokin. An appropriate list of people who may be of interest to Russia in exchange for Ukrainian prisoners of war has been drawn up. Both from ours and Russia's lists, there were very different people. But the list provided by the Russians was simply shocking: a murderer, a spy, a bandit. Of course, we did not release everyone whom Russia wanted to take away. Main entrance of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine on the Resnitska Star. Probably not all readers know that at that time, about 3,000 citizens of Ukraine were released from Russian captivity, 822 in 2014 and 2,135 in 2015. The process that preceded the exchange took place in confidence, without the involvement of the press and government officials. Publicity would only harm this case. The story of the release of our prisoners of war was mentioned by General, current Deputy, 51. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Serhiy Krivonos, in an interview with Politika.com.ua on August 24th each, on the occasion of Ukraine's Independence Day. I am grateful for the quick and effective decisions on the exchange of our prisoners in 2014 to 2015, as during these years, we saw the highest numbers of exchanges. Only a few know about the role Mr. Shokin played in the exchange of these hostages, and this is very sad. 3,000 released volunteers and soldiers of the armed forces, incompatible with the latest figures which the current Ukrainian government declares victoriously at every step. In 2019 to 2020, only 86% of our compatriots who were illegally detained in Russia returned to Ukraine. I also convinced Petro Poroshenko, of the need to create a special operations force of the armed forces in the conflict zone. Some people know that the person who convinced President Poroshenko was Prosecutor General, Mr. Viktor Shokin. Viktor Mikolayevich handed over to the president the concept of the SSO, the draft of the draft law, and persuaded him to make a positive decision, said General Krivonos. The fact that under my leadership, the Prosecutor General's office began to produce effective investigations, work, and reforms became apparent in the summer of 2015. Jan Tombinsky, the then ambassador of the European Union to Ukraine, said in an interview, "We have not previously seen such reform in Ukraine, as has occurred during the last 4 months." Ambassadors and heads of law enforcement agencies of Germany, Great Britain, Sweden, Switzerland, Belgium, Latvia, Hungary, and other countries also responded positively to my work. Browse the links of the GPU website, and you will find it all. On February 19, 2015, I held a working meeting with U.S. Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary in Ukraine, Jeffrey Payette. He congratulated me on my appointment and praised the beginning of my activity. In response to my letter dated May 13, 2015, regarding the improvement of the fight against the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, Tominsky, legislative work on reforms has intensified in Ukraine over the past 4 months. We have not seen such high work with reforms as in the last 4 months in Ukraine for many years, he said. The level of legislative work to ensure reforms in Ukraine is now the highest in many years. This was announced on TV channel 112 Ukraine by the head of the European Commission EC in Ukraine, Jan Tombinsky. Source, corruption. Addressed to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, I received a response from the U.S. Department of State. On behalf of Kerry, his deputy, Victoria Nuland, assured that the United States was impressed by Ukraine's ambitious law enforcement reform program and anti-corruption system. Yes, the same Victoria Nuland, the senior U.S. official, who handed out cookies and cakes on the Maidan during the Revolution of Dignity. She noted the importance of the historic moment in 54. Chapter request for professional's appointment as Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. Street Riznitaka, 1315, KY 1001, Secretary of State of the United States of America, Mr. John F. Kerry. Dear Mr. Kerry, the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine expresses its high respect for the State Department of the United States of America and has the honor to address with the following. At this difficult time for our country, the Ukrainian people are sincerely grateful to the American people for the support and comprehensive assistance we receive from the United States. In the conditions of struggle against external aggression on the part of the Russian Federation, protection and defense of our state became the most important task of the leadership of Ukraine. We strive to do everything necessary to protect Ukraine, and we are grateful for your help at a time when the word of Russian invasion hangs over Ukraine. One of the serious problems for the stability and sustainable socioeconomic development of our state is corruption. We understand that it is impossible to implement reforms when people believe that the government is not working in their interests. That is why, in addition to defense, one of the pentity tasks currently facing Ukraine is the practical implementation of effective measures to prevent and eradicate corruption. Important steps have already been taken to demonstrate the determination of the state leadership to overcome this turbulent phenomenon. The decree of the President of Ukraine approved the anti-corruption strategy for 2014 to 2017, within the framework of which the Parliament of Ukraine adopted a package of anti-corruption laws. Significant changes in the context of public administration reform and the fight against corruption are also expected by the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine, which plays a key role in prosecuting corrupt officials. Letter from Prosecutor General of Ukraine V. Shokin to the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry regarding assistance in financing the fight against corruption in the GPU, May 13, 2015, p. 1. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. In October 2014, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted a new law of Ukraine on the prosecution, the provisions of which were highly praised by the international community. The law enters into force on July 15, 2015, for its proper implementation and reorganization of the institution in accordance with European standards. Significant changes in the organization of the prosecutor's office require the involvement of experts familiar with the best world experience in das field. To this end, it is planned to establish UN independent advisory body at the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine from among legal professionals from the United States of America. At the end of 2014, the United States Congress allocated funds to support the transition to democracy and long-term development of countries experiencing crisis, including measures to develop, strengthen, and protect democratic institutions and processes. We ask you to consider allocating $7 million to the United States Agency for International Development Assistance to Ukraine. This assistance would allow the establishment of an independent anti-corruption consultative body with international recognition and authority at the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. The functioning of such a body provided an opportunity to obtain professional legal support from American experts in the process of reforming the Ukrainian Prosecutor's Office, applying anti-corruption mechanisms, and preventing money laundering. I am grateful in advance for your support of this initiative and for promoting the democratic development of Ukraine. Sincerely, Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin. Letter from Prosecutor General of Ukraine V. Shokin to the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry regarding assistance in financing the fight against corruption in the GPU, May 13, 2015, p. Combating injustice through vigorous investigation and prosecution of Maidan cases and the return of stolen assets to the Ukrainian people. Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Chairman of the Ukrainian Bar Association, Sviatoslav Piskun, emphasized 3 times on the News 1 TV channel on October 16, 2019, that the best Prosecutor General under President Poroshenko was Viktor Shokin. Source, letter from Assistant Secretary of State V. Nuland, June 11, 2015, p1. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Letter from Assistant Secretary of State V. Nuland, June 11, 2015, p2, Chapter 2. Request for professionals. Appointment as Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Letter from Assistant Secretary of State V. Newland, June 11th, 2015, 3:59. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Even some characters of domestic politics, who will soon become fierce critics, praised my work. A well-known investigative journalist, and at that time, the People's Deputy of Ukraine, Serhiy Lishchenko, hotly declared, Shokin is the best Prosecutor General of Ukraine for the last 20 years. In a few months, donors of Serhiy Lishchenko's will start harassing me, and the MP, who is apparently completely focused on Joseph Biden, will express diametrically opposed views in the Rada and in his debunking blogs. At the same time, they will try to clean the information space from their positive statements about me. Would be better for a young deputy to consult with a conscience about the reason for such a sharp change of his position. I tried to ignore it. I fought for justice and felt a high responsibility then, first of all, before the people of his country. Chapter request for professional's appointment as Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Lishchenko, Shokin, during last 20 years, the best prosecutor. The People's Deputy, Sergei Lishchenko, commented on his decision to vote for the candidate Viktor Shokin for the post of Prosecutor General. We all want Kennedy to be the president of Ukraine, Balcerowicz, as Prime Minister, and Greenspan as the head of the National Bank, but they're simply not on our list of contenders. Commissioner Cattant and Detective Colombo are also not contenders either. We would like to, but they are absent from the lot. In addition, among those who are listed as contenders, Shokin. Not perfect, but far from the worst choice. If he fails, we will fire him. As a journalist, I remember Shokin as the person who initiated proceedings against Bukach, Kolesnikov, Kushnani, and Kolomnisky. As a person who communicates with some investigators of the Prosecutor General's office, I have insider information of how Shokin performed in this position. Accordingly, he is the best proposal for the post of Prosecutor General over the past 20 years. Source, Chapter 3, How Poroshenko Sold Prosecutor General of Ukraine to the Biden for $1 billion. Dismissal. Joseph Biden during his visit to Kyiv and Petro Poroshenko, December 2015, A. Now I can't even remember the day and time when Petro Poroshenko first started to hint that he wanted to remove me from office, but it definitely began with conversations about Burisma. Something like, it is not necessary to force the investigation. Biden is dissatisfied because his son is on the board of directors, and we must understand Ukraine's dependence on America, which means dependence on Biden's support and so on. Poroshenko did not say, close the case. In fact, he would not have dared to say this to me, because he knew very well that this was the height of lawlessness, and I respected the law. He understood this very well. In his persistent do not put pressure on Burisma, rather read a recommendation to put the brakes on. One of the highlighted episodes which signaled that Biden was dissatisfied with Prosecutor General of Ukraine in connection with the Burisma case was the accusation of U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Payette. On September 25, 2015, during a business forum in Odessa, Ambassador Payette suddenly stated that in the case of Burisma, the results of the investigation are unsatisfactory. But why Burisma? It is easy to explain. Ambassador Payette was an assembler of Vice President Biden's mind position, and he was only interested in the Burisma case among the thousands of cases. It was a shock for the whole law enforcement system because everything was just the opposite. This was a double shock for all diplomats because the ambassadors have no right to interfere in the internal affairs of the country. Such a statement by the ambassador looked like a brazen interference by an authorized representative of a foreign state into the course of a criminal investigation. Payette's assessment puzzled not only Ukrainian investigators and diplomats, but also the British Embassy. Within few hours, Patrick Torkington, a staff member of the British Embassy in Ukraine and an international liaison officer for the National Crime Agency, sent an official statement to the GPU's main investigation department stating that neither he nor his country understood the motives of the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine. British law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation of criminal cases against Burisma and, according to a London court decision, blocked Michael Zlochevsky's bank accounts for $23 million in the spring of 2014. To put it mildly, we're surprised by the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. This assessment of the ambassador of the United States, it was said in the message. To be honest, Burisma was not my priority at work. Of course, I was well informed about the progress of the investigation, what new investigators had dug up, what new facts they had discovered. However, in the foreground, I kept the affairs of the Maidan and the crimes of Yanukovych and his government officials, the rescue of Ukrainian prisoners of war captured in the Donbass. There was an immense amount of work. I worked 24/7 with almost no days off. President Poroshenko reminded me about Burisma more and more often from the fall of 2015. He was annoyed, and the tension between us was growing. Around that time, the sporadic attacks on me began in the media. Additionally, there was even an attempt on my life. On November 2nd, 2015, an unknown assailant shot at the windows of Prosecutor General's office on Risnetska Street. I was saved by the armored glass, which was prudently installed by Pshonka, the Prosecutor General of Yanukovych. I did not even know that the windows in the office are armored. I will tell this story very briefly, the investigation of which, as far as I know, still is not over. It was late in the evening. We planned together with my assistant, Volodymyr Stetsenko, to work in the coming weeks. The phone rang. It was Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin. Suddenly, in the middle of the conversation, Klimkin asks anxiously, "Is it okay they shoot there?" And at that moment, the assistant grabs my hand and with a shout, "Let's go out! Push me out of the office!" It all happened in a matter of seconds. I didn't even have time to understand what was happening. Security guards arrived, then a special unit of the SBU arrived. Found 3 bullet holes in the window frame. I told the investigators that if they really wanted to kill me, then first, they would have killed me. And second, they would have done it elsewhere, definitely not at the office. By the way, shortly before the assassination attempt, A pistol was found in the corridor near my waiting room, hidden in the battery but uncharged. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. And now, almost 5 years later, I don't understand what it was. An assassination attempt? Threat? Warning? Then from whose side? There are more questions than answers. However, obviously, there was a real threat to my life, and you will understand why. So, in the fall of 2015, our official relations with Petro Poroshenko became strained. It was becoming increasingly clear that this president of Ukraine no longer needed a strong general prosecutor. Apparently, the decision on my resignation was made by Poroshenko much earlier than our principled conversation about it took place, 3 months earlier. I heard that back in November 2015, Yuri Lutsenko on his knees asked Poroshenko to appoint him as a general prosecutor. A man who saw this told me about this scene. This happened when the president of Ukraine and Lutsenko were on a visit to Japan. I have no reason not to trust this information because I know Yuri Vitalyevich well, and I know a lot about him in all his roles. In any case, according to telephone conversations published by MP Andriy Derkach, President Petro Poroshenko and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry discussed my resignation in early December 2015. I just wanted to try to urge you to understand whether there is a way to solve this problem, to replace Prosecutor General of Ukraine, you know whom, Shokin. I know that the Vice President is very concerned about this, and I think it would be good to try to find a solution to the problem, Mr. Kerry said at that time. Petro Alexievich came to the solution to the problem identified by the U.S. Secretary of State, dictated by Vice President Joseph Biden. In an original way, he called me and tried to scare me. Biden is going to Kyiv and will bring data of your corruption. I shrugged. Well, let him come, because I knew that corruption can be invented, even for me. On December 15th, 2015, Joe Biden arrived in Kyiv on a visit, and politicians and political scientists in Ukraine were lost in understanding the essence of this trip. It is now clear that Biden's visit had no purpose other than to try to hide his connection with the corrupt Ukrainian gas company Burisma. The U.S. Vice President spoke eloquently in the Verkhovna Rada. Now, knowing the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Purpose of his visit, this speech seems to be an example of cynicism and double standards of this politician. However, he did not say a word about Shokin and my mythical acts of corruption. Later, when the opportunity arose, I told Poroshenko, Petro Alexievich, Joe Biden is the second person in one of the most influential countries in the world. At his disposal are the FBI, the CIA, and other intelligence services. If he didn't bring any proof of my alleged corruption, then there must be none. Right? Poroshenko was silent because he had nothing to answer. The only thing Biden brought to me in December 2015 was a dose of political poison. He blackmailed Petro Poroshenko by saying that $1 billion loan tranche would not be issued to Ukraine unless the president fired me. On August 22, 2016, Joe Biden repeated in an interview with The Atlantic, chapter The How Pushanka Sold Prosecutor General of Into the Titan for $1 billion. Deal. The Atlantic. Source. 2016-08. Biden Doctrine. 496,841. Less than Peter. You don't get $1 billion. Greater than, Biden reminded him. Well, you can keep the general. Just understand. We will not pay if you do greater than. Later, on January 23, 2018, Joe Biden confirmed his words by speaking at the Foreign Policy Council in Washington. Less than Peter. You won't get your $1 billion if you don't fire this son of a bitch. Well, that's fine. You can leave, general prosecutor, but in that case, keep that in mind. We will not pay greater than. 74. The true stories about von Fiden's international corruption in Krin. Source http www.frangelwand/forum of fame. Issue launch former LT President Lo Luden. The fact that Joe Biden directly interfered in the internal affairs of Ukraine and, in particular, removed me illegally from the post prosecutor general is objectively confirmed by the data of the investigations. Another testimony can be found in the documentary Joe Biden, a friend or an enemy of corruption, filmed by French journalist Olivier Barouilly, founder of www.lescrises.fr, which specializes in geopolitics and the international economy. The first part of the film is called Not Such a Reliable Prosecutor. This is just about the scandal surrounding my resignation, which was provoked by Biden defending the corrupt company Burisma. I was interested to hear a comment from Colin Kahl, Joe Biden's personal consultant in 2014 to 2017. The general opinion, not only in the United States but also in the IMF, was that Shokin became a kind of stumbling block. In December 2015, Vice President Joe Biden left for Kyiv. So we talked on the plane about his performance, about loan guarantees for Ukraine. The vice president was then instructed by his advisors, as well as by Victoria Nuland, who was with us on the plane. After landing in Kyiv, he was also instructed by Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Payette. But after consultations, the vice president told us, listen, I'll just tell Poroshenko that he won't get the money if he doesn't get Shokin to resign. He said this in a very commanding tone. This is because I was convinced that we would never have such a strong means of pressure. This story was supplemented later by Mr. Kent's testimony in the United States about Vice President Biden. 76. The true stories about Vertiden's international corruption in. So President Poroshenko, without hesitation, sold me for $1 billion. Diplomat tells investigators he raised alarms. In 2015, about Hunter Biden's Ukraine work, but was rebuffed. A career State Department official overseeing Ukraine Pollard told McConnell investigators this work that B had raised concerns in early 2015 about the vice. President Joe Biden's son ring on the board of a three company, but was turned away by a bid staffer, according to the people familiar with the testimony. Source. He raised alarms in minus 2015 about Hunter Biden's Ukraine work, but wars red 2019, 10, 18.
9520 to 0, BGAB B18, AB63, story.html.
By the way, I wanted to know where this money was going. He found in Open Financial sources only scant information that the funds were allegedly less than directed to social assistance to the poor of Ukraine, who suffered from the increase in gas tariffs. From mid to December 2015, when backstage, agreements between Biden and the Ukrainian president lasted until mid to February 2016. Poroshenko did not talk to me about this resignation. Of course, I understood that black clouds were gathering over me, but the offer to resign never materialized. Meanwhile, investigators came to certain results in the case of Burisma, and on February 4th, at the request of the GPU, the court once again seized the property of the owner of Burisma, Mykola Zlochevsky. Among other things, 2 of his estates of 1,000 square meters and 2,300 square meters were seized, as well as a Rolls-Royce Phantom. I think Zlochevsky ran to Biden Sr., or conveyed his indignation through Gunner. Then Joe Biden called Petro Poroshenko, and he asked me to come. "What are you doing again?" he growled. "Why are you forcing this investigation?" I suppose Petro Poroshenko promised Joe Biden that everything would be okay, but it turned out not okay for them, so the curator of Ukraine was angry. About this time, I met an old acquaintance who worked in the government, and he said that the other day, talking to the president, and he mentioned me on occasion, to which Petro Poroshenko waved his hand and advised, "Forget about Shokin, he is already gone." In other words, Poroshenko, before talking to me about the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, this resignation had already spoken of it as a fait accompli with other acquaintances. This difficult conversation took place on February 16th. "Viktor Nikolaevich, you have to go," the president said calmly, and he began to think aloud under what reason to resign, because I, as he himself admitted, work well. "Right," he advised, "for health reasons." "But I'm in good health," I say. "Well, then write off your own free will." Honestly, it was annoying. The bitter taste of injustice, the same as that day, does not leave me all these years. On the same day, February 16th, 2016, President Poroshenko, for the Biden's pleasure, without even waiting for my letter of resignation, made a televised address to the Ukrainian people regarding my dismissal as a fait accompli. Viktor Shokin has implemented the reforms that Prosecutor General's office has resisted for decades, depriving the Prosecutor's Office of General Supervision, establishing the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the State Bureau of Investigation, etc. The website said on behalf of the President of Ukraine, on one hand, it has been progress, but on the other hand, the Prosecutor General's office, unfortunately, has not been able to gain the public's trust, and that is why the issue of Prosecutor General's resignation is on the agenda. Realizing how much money my warring state needed, I had to agree with the decision of the President of Ukraine, and on February 19th, 2016, I applied for dismissal. So, the desire of a very influential American, Joe Biden, was the only reason for the resignation of Prosecutor General of independent Ukraine. Petro Poroshenko himself admits that there were no other reasons in telephone conversation with Joe Biden, the recordings of which were made public by the above-mentioned Deputy Andriy Derkach. Despite the fact that we do not have any accusations of corruption against him, Shokin, we do not have any information about his offenses, I asked him to resign, Poroshenko said. Shokin took a state position, and despite the fact that he has the support of Parliament at the end of our meeting with him, he promised to submit a statement of his dismissal. An hour ago, he brought me an application for dismissal. Here, the 5th president of Ukraine adds, "This is my second step in keeping." The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, the promise. What was the first? We can only guess. Or wait for the investigation to establish this one day. Listening to Peter Alexievich's telephone dialogues with Uncle Joe, I recalled a statement from U.S. President Johnson to illustrate the asymmetry of their relationship. When I need your opinion, I'll let you know. On February 19th, President Poroshenko submitted to the Verkhovna Rada a draft resolution dismissing me from the post of Prosecutor General. The vote in the parliamentary hall took place almost 2 months later, on March 29, in violation of the constitutional procedure. When the question of my resignation was considered, at least 4 deputies were not present in the session hall, but their cards voted. As I later pointed out in the administrative lawsuit for reinstatement as Prosecutor General of Ukraine, the list of roll call voting shows that MPs Dubinin OI, Kuzmenko AI, Moskalenko YM, and Sviatosh DV allegedly took part in the voting of the above-mentioned resolution, but did not confirm their presence on that day in the Verkhovna Rada with their own signature in the registration certificate. Did not pass either written or electronic registration. I am sure that a significant part of the deputies, European Court of Human Rights, Sviatosh Dmitry Vladimirovich, People's Deputy of Ukraine of the 8th Convocation, born on June 15, 1971. Registered at the address, Kharkiv Region, Kharkiv, Shevchenkivsky District, Nauki Avenue, BLD. Number 65, ROC P2, 60-980-6979. Statement, I, Sviatosh Dmitry Volodymyrovich, passport 342,641 Mozambican medicals, issued by Dzerzhinsky District Court in Kharkiv, off the State Migration Service of Ukraine in Kharkiv Region on May 16, 2014. Inform you that on March 29, 2016, during the voting in the Verkhovna Rada of GAEA by the President of Ukraine, Afim Shokin, from the post of Prosecutor General of Ukraine, was absent in the session hall of the Parliament and did not take part in the voting. August 1, 2019, signature City Kyiv, Ukraine, on the 1st of August, 2019. I, Sadikov Pai, a private notary of the Kyiv City Notarial District, certify the authenticity of the signature of Sviatosh Dmitry Volodymyrovich, which was made in my presence. The identity of Sviatosh Dmitry Volodymyrovich, who signed it, has been established, his legal capacity has been checked, fees have been collected by agreement. Private notary, Ministry of Justice of Ukraine. The statement of the People's Deputy D. Sviatosh to the ECHR testifies that he did not vote for the dismission of Shokin, but his voice was counted. August 1st, 2019. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Votes was bought. This was discussed by journalists and political experts at the time. It is no secret that the resignation of Prosecutor General Shokin was accompanied by more than one violation of Ukrainian law, and button-pushing in the Rada during the vote for his resignation. Not the most interesting of them. There is another resonant and underestimated by anti-corruption bodies evidence of ex-Deputy Alexander Onyshenko about bribery of deputies, which to this day no one has denied. After all, according to Onyshenko, the parliament not only appointed Yuri Lutsenko, the new head of the Prosecutor General's office, for money, but also fired his predecessor Viktor Shokin in such a simple way, said political scientist Ruslan Bortnik. According to political experts, $2 to $3 million were spent on the media campaign to discredit me. A very serious and costly information campaign has been going on for at least 6 months. I have seen several such waves of information. According to the most modest estimates, $2 to $3 million were invested in such a campaign on Shokin. Political scientist Andriy Zolotarev commented on Channel 24. I can only imagine how much it cost to stimulate the deputies to agree to Lutsenko's appointment, because my successor does not even have a legal education. His candidacy was pushed in Parliament for more than 2 months. And all this lawlessness was dedicated, in fact, to the whims of Joe Biden. The presidential decree on my dismissal was finally issued on April 3rd, 2016. It's hard to convey my emotions from all this dirty political history. What killed me the most was that a gentleman from overseas, taking advantage of the extremely difficult situation in Ukraine, could play with the fate of my country, like puppets, could remove and appoint the highest government officials at a whim. I was killed by such humiliation of my country. On December 22nd, 2016, I appealed to the Supreme Administrative Court of Ukraine, SAKU. It is no secret that last year's resignation of Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin was accompanied by more than one violation of Ukrainian law. And the silencing of deputies in the council during the vote for his dismissal is not the most interesting of them, said on his Facebook page, the political scientist, director of the Ukrainian Institute of Analysis and Policy Management, Ruslan Bortnik. There is also an extremely resonant and underestimated by anti-corruption authorities statement of the person involved in the gas case, People's Deputy Alexander Onyshenko, about bribery of these very deputies, which no one has denied to this day. Source, 83. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, to declare my removal as illegal and revoke this decree, as well as the resolution of the Verkhovna Rada, which approved my dismissal. At a later date, the court refused to satisfy my claim. On March 28, 2017, I filed an application with the Supreme Court of Ukraine to consider the issue of reinstatement. However, the court unreasonably rejected my request. Then, on October 25, 2017, I filed a lawsuit with the European Court of Human Rights. I believe that everything that happened to me in recent years, the blackmail and pressure from Joe Biden, the coercion of the president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, from ETP, resigned from the post of Prosecutor General, and the story of bribing deputies for my dismissal and assassination attempts on my life will be investigated in time, and the perpetrators will be punished. Chapter 4. What Burisma is. Fabulous enrichment of Zlochevsky with the theft of Ukrainian subsoil. Burisma gas wells are available throughout Ukraine. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Why did Vice President Biden need a head of Prosecutor General of Ukraine? I have one answer. He wanted to hide his own corrupt activities in Ukraine, and especially that one which related to the gas giant called Burisma. Biden thought he would succeed if Shokin was office. Then, in February 2016, Biden believed that he had already succeeded. So, not in 6 hours, but in 5 months, Joe Biden finally got what he wanted, to replace Shokin with Lutsenko, as they say in the film of Olivier Berruyer. All this pressure for Shokin's resignation is a very strange phenomenon in international politics. What did Shokin do, that even the Vice President of USA resorted to throwing insults? The independent publication helps us to understand this. They conducted its investigation. As for Burisma, publication explains that the Burisma case was part of a widespread corruption scheme in Ukraine to accuse the oligarch to seize his property to agree on a bribe to stop the investigation. The journalist of the edition wrote that Poroshenko was in the center of such a scheme of extortion. And now it is clear why the scandal is of such scale, the journalist of this edition writes. What is Burisma, and why does this offshore company have such an impact on high politics? Burisma is one of the largest private companies in Ukraine for the production of hydrocarbons, primarily natural gas. Now it controls more than 30% of the Ukrainian subsoil in private use, giving access to all minerals and natural resources within. The company has 35 production licenses in all gas-rich regions of the country, from Kharkiv in the Dnipro-Donetsk basin in the east to Prikopatya and Lviv in the west. It provides more than 30% of all natural gas produced in Ukraine, more than 1 billion cubic meters of gas per year. They sell all extracted gas on the domestic market. Burisma unites 12 domestic companies, making deep exploration, production, and sale of natural gas. The largest company is Eskopivnich, where monthly production level is approximately 37 million cubic meters. Others include Pari, first Ukrainian oil and gas company, Aldia, and Technocom Service. The holding also includes a large mining. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Company Cube Gas, which Mykola Zlochevsky bought after the sudden death in 2015 of its previous owner, Jan Kolchik, who was called the richest Pole in the world. The Ukrainian company Burisma Holdings Limited is owned by the Cyprus-registered company Brocity Investments Limited, the actual owner of which is Mykola Zlochevsky. He founded Burisma together with his partner Mykola Lysin in 2002 year. However, in those days, the company did not have the right to field development independently. It drilled wells and extracted gas under agreements with state-owned enterprises. The development had begun at the end of 2003, when Zlochevsky lobbied for a decision by the National Security and Defense Council to establish a state committee for natural resources, which he actually headed himself. The newly appointed chairman launched tenders for the sale of special permits for the right to use subsoil. You can easily guess whose companies have participated in these competitions with 100% success rate. The first license for the development of oil and gas fields Esco North received in July 2004 year. The second, 3 weeks later. The third, in October of the same year. Pari, which is also part of the Burisma Group, received 5 more gas production permits. After Lysen died in a car accident, all property rights passed to Mykola Zlochevsky. When President Viktor Yushchenko came to power in 2005, Zlochevsky was removed from the leadership of the State Committee for Subsoil, and the rapid development of his gas business ceased. The owner of Burisma, meanwhile, was preparing a speculative political platform from which it would be possible to start a second business. He joined the Party of Regions, and in 2006 year, he was elected People's Deputy. When Yanukovych came to power, Zlochevsky headed the State Committee for Material Reserves of Ukraine, and finally in 2010 he became Minister of Environment. This ministry interested him not because the gas trader loved his country's nature, but because the responsibility of the Ministry of Environment also included control of the subsoil. 2010 to 2012 was a prime time for Burisma, whose subsidiaries received a total of more than 24 licenses to develop oil and gas fields. Simply saying, Mykola Zlochevsky. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine issued himself permits for the exploitation of the subsoil of Ukraine. For example, his main asset, Esco North, at that time grew more than 10 times. Before 2010, this company produced only 30 million cubic meters of gas per year, and by the end of 2013, it had become a major player with production figures of almost 400 million cubic meters. This is the story of Zlochevsky's fabulous enrichment. Of course, after the Revolution of Dignity, he fled the country. On March 27, 2014, the GPU investigators opened the first criminal proceedings I.O. of state funds during Zlochevsky's term as Minister of Environmental Protection. These were facts that, in a manner of speaking, were laid bare for all to see. Mykola Zlochevsky was charged with embezzlement of 49.38 million UH. He was informed of the suspicions on December 30th, 2014. From April to December 2014, 4 more proceedings were opened, involving the former Minister of Deep Drilling, his wife and daughter, as well as companies belonging to the holding Burisma. There was found a complicated and intricate scheme of transfer of funds from the accounts of some subsidiaries of Burisma to others, which were withdrawn from the country offshore and settled in the pockets of the ex-minister and his family. Before I become a head of prosecution general, there were already 7 open cases, if I'm not mistaken. Most of them were joined under one processing number, 42,14,805. All details and evidence of this case were gathered into several volumes, which included in particular episodes, schemes to defraud money, where the Yanukovych family was involved, as well as young oligarch Sergei Korchenko. Ukrainian investigators dug, and in the process they found further signs of crimes. Accordingly, new cases were initiated. Not only were the Ukrainian Organization of Justice interested in Burisma's activity, but the British also. In March 2014, the UK Anti-Fraud Office launched an investigation based the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine on suspicions of laundering $50 million. British investigators found that in the period from November 22, 2013 to February 24, 2014, the same time when the Maidan was taking place in Ukraine, Zlochevsky's accounts in LGT Bank in Switzerland were filled with the transfer from Brosidy's bank account by the 3 payments totaling the amount of $15.10 million US. The investigators called those transactions suspicious. In addition, from December 19, 2013 to January 22, 2014, $35 million was credited to Brosidy's account in BNP Paribas Bank from Cipriato Alliance Limited, registered in Belize. Finally, in this case, according to the decision of the Central Criminal Court of London, 23.50 million dollars were frozen in the accounts of Zlochevsky's companies. Therefore, the British asked the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine to provide information about Zlochevsky and related companies. However, the GPU was in no hurry to respond. Let me remind you that the international administrations were supervised by the Deputy Prosecutor General Vitaly Kasko, and it was his job to answer such inquiries. I am sure that Kasko deliberately procrastinated. A few months later, when he sent a short reply knowing in advance that it would not satisfy the British. Instead, Mykola Zlochevsky's lawyers received a certificate from the GPU stating uncertain legal status and absence of any notifications about suspicions, which they successfully used during a court hearing in London in December 2014. The British law enforcement officers got an answer, which they were waiting for, from Ukraine on January 21, 2015, when a London court, after receiving no information from Ukrainian investigators, lifted the freezing of Zlochevsky's accounts. Ukraine's budget could be increased by $23.50 million. However, this did not happen because, and I will call a spade, Kasko's sabotage. The GPU opened a criminal case on this fact in 2016. After I was forced to resign, this case was probably closed due to the Joseph Biden's and the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, Marie Jovanovich's protection of Vitaly Kask. Chapter 5, M. Zlochevsky and Gunter Biden, Washington Shield for, Burisma, Family Business, Joseph Biden, and Gunter Biden. The true stories about Titan's international corruption in the management of the Burisma Gas Production Company. Far left, Mykola Zlochevsky. Fourth from left, Alexander Kwasniewski. Third from right, Gunter Biden. Photo from open sources. Let me remind you that after the victory of the Revolution of Dignity, Zlochevsky's umbrella of protection disappeared to Russia. Yes, Yanukovych and his government officials fled Ukraine. Mykola Zlochevsky also fled, but in another direction, to the west. The ex-minister was well aware that the new government would sooner or later turn their attention onto him, so he began to look for another strong, less than umbrella, greater than. He quickly realized that in these historical circumstances, protection could only be provided by influential Americans. Thus, in May 2014, the board of directors of Burisma was renewed due to the uncertainty surrounding persons still in place in Ukraine. First of all, Gunter Biden, son of the U.S. Vice President, as well as former Polish President Alexander Kwasniewski, and the second stepson of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry Devon Archer, with whom Gunter had been friends since their student years. By the way, Archer was arrested in the United States a few years ago for securities fraud. According to the Wall Street Journal, he is accused of selling fictitious bonds worth $43 million. Source. In 2017, the former director of the CIA Anti-Terrorist Center, Joseph Kofer Black, who is also not a hydrocarbon specialist, was brought onto the board of directors of Burisma. Intuition did not betray Zlochevsky, almost at the same time when he was negotiating the protection of his not very transparent business. The GPU studied carefully the origin of his wealth, and in late March 2014 began the first criminal, the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Board of Directors. Alan Apter, chairman of the board of directors, has 27 years of experience in investment banking institutions, including Merrill Lynch, Renaissance Capital, Troika Dialogue, and Morgan Stanley. Alexander Kwasniewski, director, president of the Republic of Poland in 1995 to 2005. Member of the board of trustees of the International Crisis Group. Hunter Biden, director, lawyer at the national law firm Boies Schiller, Flexner LLP, New York, USA. Member of the board of directors of the United States World Food Program. Joseph Kofer Black, director, former head of the CIA Anti-Terrorism Center, 1999 to 2002, and ambassador at large for the fight against terrorism for the fight in 2000. Burisma Board of Directors, 2014. Proceedings for money laundering and abuse of position during the time of Yanukovych's government. I assume that Zlochevsky was acquainted with Joseph Biden before 2014, at least he had. Strong connections with people around the vice president. It is difficult to find another explanation for the fact that the request for an umbrella to shield Burisma was granted fairly quickly. Before accepting the offer of the Ukrainian gas tycoon, Biden used the services of an audit company to obtain a certificate on the state of affairs in Burisma. In this case, I'm talking about this audit document with a certain sarcasm, and I put that word in quotes because the person from Obama's administration, who was responsible for the approach to Ukraine's politics, could not help but know about the origins of Zlochevsky's wealth and the origins of Burisma. I am actually ashamed about what I will tell on the next pages of this book, but I have to show all the cynicism of Joe Biden, who, despite the extremely difficult situation in his family that time, still continued to build corruption schemes involving members of his family. What is Gunter Biden like? According to his work biography, which can be deceptive, you would conclude he was proficiently competent. He managed to be a lawyer, a lobbyist, the vice president of a company that issued credit cards, sat on the board of directors of the state railway company in China, and was even in the U.S. Navy, but never in energy. This proves once again that Gunter played the role of a highly paid wedding general, a Russian term, to show you are very well connected in Burisma. I must say that this role is quite common for the son of the vice president of the United States he is. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, or has previously been a member of the supervisory boards of various international organizations, from the Peace Corps to the National Democratic Institute, NDI. By the way, Gunter was fired from the ranks of the Navy reservists for using cocaine, and for some time after he was unemployed. That happened immediately before his father hired him for a Ukrainian gas company. The American media has repeatedly reported on scandals related to young Biden's addiction to alcohol, drugs, and strip clubs. For example, more than once due to his wild behavior, he was unable to get to the office in the morning. In October 2016, according to the American press, Gunter rented a car from Hertz and, whilst driving on Highway 10 near Palm Spring, lost control, drove across the oncoming lane, and crashed into a stationary car on the opposite side of the road. The Hertz representative arrived at the scene and replaced the damaged car with another one. The big man continued on his way and soon lost control again, this time on a mountain road. As he later explained to the Hertz representative, a huge owl flew over the hood, then flew after me and fell on the headlights. The shaken driver honestly admitted that he had no idea whether the owl was real or a product of his hallucinations, because he had not slept and used drugs for several nights before the trip. This story is from the testimony of the head of Hertz in Prescott, where he reported an accident caused by an owl. After inspecting the damage to the car driven by Gunter Biden, a representative of the Hertz found traces of white powder on one of the consoles. Gunter has been treated several times for drug and alcohol addiction. He was a client at the Charles O'Brien Addiction Treatment Center at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was required to carry a breathalyzer with a built-in camera, and then underwent treatment programs at the Esalen Institute and the Colmack Outpatient Treatment Center in Washington. In June 2014 the board of directors of Burisma already included the name of Biden Jr. He was treated in a clinic in Tijuana, Mexico, under an extraordinary program. The fact is that Tijuana uses ibogaine, a psychotropic alkaloid derived from the roots of a West African shrub, since this method of. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Rehabilitating alcoholics is banned in the United States. Gunter traveled to Africa, as well as Mexico. I was also struck by another fact from the biography of the son of the Vice President of the United States. Gunter had a long affair with his brother's Beau wife, Hallie. After Beau died, Gunter, who was still married to Catherine Biden and had 3 children, announced that he wanted to marry his brother's widow. The father and his second wife, Jill, publicly supported this intention. Joe Biden told the press, "We are lucky that Gunter and Hallie found each other, because after such grief they are together again. They have the fullest support of me and Jill, and we are happy for them." In 2018, the couple rented a house in Annapolis, Maryland, and settled there with Hallie's 2 children. However, a few months later, the newlyweds divorced. Another important touch to Gunter's personality can be found in open, official American sources. In 2009, when Joe Biden entered the White House as vice president, Gunter founded Seneca. Co-founded by David Archer and Christopher Hines, the adopted son of then Secretary of State John Kerry. In the summer of 2013, Archer and Gunter signed an agreement with Jonathan Lee, a head of the large Chinese company Bohai Capital BHR. In December, Gunter and his father flew to China, where, among other things, Joe Biden and Jonathan Lee met. Coincidentally, just 10 days after the trip, Gunter was appointed as head of the BHR. Official sources say that the authorized capital of the company is $1 billion. The New York Times reported that Gunter Biden owned 10% of BHR. According to experts from the University of Chicago, this is equivalent to about $20 million. I assume that back in 2013, the father and son duo worked out a political corruption scheme in China. So why not do the same in Ukraine? Not a rhetorical question at all if you analyze the facts. Vice President Biden must have been indifferent to the fact that international anti-corruption law, which applies in both the United States and China, prohibits American companies from hiring children if their parents are high-ranking officials. Even a cursory acquaintance with the biography of Gunter Biden gives a clear idea of the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, his personality. However, Zlochevsky, who invited Gunter to Burisma, didn't care for what this man was or whether he understood the gas and energy sector in general. The only thing that mattered was his value as a new member of the board of directors, the name and position of the father, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden. The hunter for positions where you can work little and get too much was apparently quite satisfied. When the American with the name Trump came to Burisma, the company issued a press release where they assured that Gunter Biden will manage the legal department and provide support to the holding in cooperation with international organizations. However, he later told the New York Times that the report was untrue. Nevertheless, the son of the U.S. Vice President did not specify what his role and functions were in Zlochevsky's gas empire. During searches at Burisma, investigators from Prosecutor General's office did not find any documents signed by Gunter Biden and found that he rarely appeared at work. He seldom even came to Ukraine. Burisma also gave unconvincing public. Chapter 5. M. Zlochevsky and Gunter Den Washington shields for Buryama. Explanations for the appearance on its board of directors of former Polish President Aleksander Kwasniewski, who, despite his extensive managerial experience, is also not an energy specialist. Zlochevsky's company generously paid for the actions, or better to say, inactions, of Biden Jr. According to Gunter's interview with various American publications, the monthly salary was $50,000. Nevertheless, in reality, the amounts were much higher, about $83,000 a month. Thus, from May 2014 to October 2019, for the period when Gunter was a member of the board of directors of Burisma, he received a salary of $3.5 million. We can all agree these are significant payments. From my point of view, if the members of the board of directors received less than means of illegal enrichment without performing any work, it was either a bribe. Then the question is for what? Or it was an attempt to launder money. Apparently, the company also paid for the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, trips to its VIP roof, their vacations, and so on. However, this is not all. GPU investigators found that in 20,142,015, Burisma transferred more than $160,000 per month to the accounts of the investment consulting company Rosemont Seneca Partners, co-founded by Gunter Biden. According to the Wall Street Journal, Gunter Biden, Alexander Kwasniewski, and Devon Archer received tips from the Ukrainian gas company, which landed in the accounts of offshore wire logic technology AS Digitex Organization LLP without paying taxes. According to the data received by the GPU from the Financial Intelligence Services of Latvia and Cyprus, from the end of 2013 to October 2015, from the accounts of Burisma through the mentioned offshore companies were debited to the accounts of 4 individuals: Gunter Biden, Alexander Kwasniewski, Devon Archer, Alan Aptera, €1,452,000. The so-called records of the former deputy of Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, Oleksandr Onyshenko, are also evidence about the role of Gunter and Kwasniewski in whitewashing Burisma's tainted reputation. In one of the conversations recorded, as Onyshenko claims it was in the president's office in January 2016, Poroshenko says, "Kolya is a good guy. I'll think about what can be done." Well, for some reason, the Americans have been excited about him lately. Onyshenko replies that the Americans are unlikely to take any action against Zlochevsky because he has Biden's son on board, and so does Kwasniewski. That's why there should be no interference from the West when I talk to Kolya. Of course, the support of the second person in the political hierarchy of the United States and large sums of money allowed Burisma to reduce the reputational losses in the Western world caused by investigations in Ukraine and the United Kingdom. The company has generously sponsored many social events in Europe, most notably the Monaco Energy Forum, which was enriched by the presence of Prince Albert II. In the summer of 2017, Zlochevsky even brought to Monaco a delegation of Ukrainian government officials, led by Deputy Prime Minister Kishyan. Moreover, by 2017, thanks to Biden and Poroshenko, General Prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko had closed illegally all cases against Burisma and its owner. Now Zlochevsky can be fully. 2015 P1. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Legalize in Ukraine and continue his gas business in the same unconditionally manner as it was with Yanukovych. Chapter 6. Hunting Two Rabbits. The role of the president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, in the history of Burisma. President Petro Poroshenko, 2015. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. I do not know about the personal relationship between Petro Poroshenko and Mykola Zlochevsky, but it is obvious that the two have known each other well since the 2000s, when they both entered big politics. They worked together in the government of Mykola Azarov, Petro Poroshenko was the Minister of Foreign Affairs 2009 to 2010 and the Economy 2012, and Mykola Zlochevsky headed the Ministry of Environmental Protection 2010 to 2012. In short, Petro Oleksievich managed to form the opinion that Kolya is a good guy. I must say that Poroshenko always kept an eye on the investigation of the cases against the owner of Burisma. In the first years after the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine was fond of quoting Lee Kuan Yew. He advised leaders of countries who are on the path to reforms to start by imprisoning 3 of their friends, who are the embezzlers of the state funds. Public opinion leaders asked Petro Poroshenko to use this recipe of the author of the Singapore. Note that officially Kyiv did not propose the former Minister of Environment to any list of sanctions in 2014, no later. Knowing Peter Alexievich, I can assume with high probability that already at that time he considered how and for what size of a reward to begin political agreements with Nikolai Zlochevsky. So when Joseph Biden made it clear that the prosecution of Burisma was highly undesirable, Petro Poroshenko apparently rubbed his hands with satisfaction. This allowed, as they say, to hunt 2 rabbits with 1 shot, to please the Washington curator, and to receive money from Zlochevsky for closing cases at the same time. According to open sources, Igor Kononenko, the closest ally of the president of Ukraine and deputy chairman of the parliamentary faction of the presidential party. The bloc of Petro Poroshenko, BPP, met several times during 2016 with the owner of Burisma in Spain, Vienna, and Abu Dhabi. In an interview with journalists, Alexander Onishenko retold Mykola Zlochevsky's words about their talks. Can you imagine Kononenko is flying? I'm asking him, they get money there, they don't do anything. It's profitable for them to sit somewhere far away and take $1 million from me per month and not let me into Ukraine. I want to solve everything globally, to close the case so that I can return normally. That's why I'm offering them a large sum, $50 million. 2015 P1. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, which I think is very good. After my dismissal in 2016, the frequency with which cases fell apart or courts unfroze the ex-minister's assets proved the likelihood of such a conversation. High-ranking extortionists withdrew funds from the gas trader gradually. The longer the negotiations lasted, the more the price of the question increased. That is, it was advantageous to keep Zlochevsky's case in suspense. The new general prosecutor, Yuri Lutsenko, successfully coped with this task. As I mentioned in the previous chapter of the book, by the beginning of 2017, Lutsenko will close all cases against Burisma. However, the total amount of bribes, according to the above-mentioned interview with Alexander Onishenko, soon increased to $100 million. After paying half, a conversation with Alexander Onishenko was mentioned $50 million in cash. Part of Mykola Zlochevsky's assets were unblocked. As a kind of bonus, in the fall of 2016, the Ministry of Internal Affairs removed the corrupt ex-minister from the State Investigation Department based on a resolution sent by the GPU's Department for Investigation of particularly important economic cases. Moreover, 6 months later, in January 2017, Prosecutor General Office of Yuri Lutsenko withdrew all its claims against Zlochevsky. Meanwhile, Zlochevsky's business is still working like a Swiss watch, even after he fled abroad 5 years before, almost as calmly as it had during Viktor Yanukovych's presidency. Burisma buys new gas production companies and receives new licenses for the development of Ukrainian subsoil. According to Alexander Onishenko in his book Peter V, in 2015 to 2016, Zlochevsky supplied gas to the company of people who were part of Poroshenko's team in the amount of more than $10 million. The only nuance, these deliveries were free. As Onishenko writes in his book, the owner of Burisma soon realized that Poroshenko could not make a decision on his own because Biden is still there and he has some interests of his own. I think Zlochevsky's company was seen primarily as one of the companies that, the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, can finance Hillary Clinton's election. Possibly at the expense of black cash from Ukraine, the former member of the Verkhovna Rada concluded. According to him, the deputy head of the Petro Poroshenko bloc party, Igor Kononenko, immediately entered into negotiations with Zlochevsky, and 8% after that, gas began to flow to Poroshenko's enterprises, for which he later did not pay. When Zlochevsky asked me to negotiate with Poroshenko, the amount for gas at Poroshenko's companies was already about $10 million, and it was not paid. It was, like a monthly contribution of the order of $1 million in the form of gas to Poroshenko's enterprises, which the ex-president was happy with. Criminal cases flowed. All this went on as usual, and Zlochevsky, just quietly, $1 million a month, rolled back to Kononenko and Poroshenko's enterprises. Zlochevsky was not satisfied with the situation, and at the end of 2015, he asked to speak with Poroshenko in order to end the story, the ex-People's deputy said. According to Onishenko's data, Zlochevsky owed a large amount, quite certain parts in the business that he prepared. His whole story translates into about $50 million. It was this amount that Zlochevsky owed for the closure of criminal cases. In a conversation with Poroshenko, he could no longer fully make decisions because he understood that Biden was there and he had his own interests. I think that Zlochevsky's company was regarded, first of all, as one of the companies that could finance the election of Hillary Clinton. Because Biden was there, possibly from the dark black cash money from Ukraine, he explained. Source: Objasnil kak Burisma związanas bejdenami, wymeszatelstwem wyborami. 1,659,275. Chapter 7. How General Prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko merged the cases of Burisma, Maidan, and criminals of Yanukovych era. Yuri Lutsenko on the post of the Prosecutor General, 2016, 129. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. One day, after Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine voted for the appointment of Yuri Lutsenko to the post of General Prosecutor of Ukraine, the president called me and asked me to come to Bankova Street in the evening, after 22. In the president's office, Poroshenko and Lutsenko were sitting at a table filled with all sorts of snacks and strong drinks. "Well, say hello to Prosecutor General," he said, pointing to Yuri and inviting me to the table. "Who?" I asked ironically. "There is now only one Prosecutor General. It is me. Besides, I am the former one." Yuri started to fidget in his chair. "Well, Viktor Mikolayevich, why, so you are, by God." "Vitya, help Yuri. Teach him what he should do as General Prosecutor," Poroshenko asked amicably. "What do you mean?" "You know that he does not understand such things. Tell him what Prosecutor General should do first and do after. Advise him." I replied that if Yuri sees himself as the country's chief prosecutor, let him do it by himself. Finally, we drank whiskey, talked, and Lutsenko promised to ask my advice, also about personnel issues. But he never called. It should be noted that about 3 months passed from the day Poroshenko asked me out of office to the appointment of Lutsenko as general prosecutor. Not because the president was thinking about the correctness of such a step, but because the Rada has been looking for votes in support of Lutsenko's candidacy all these months. In order to push the solution of the parliament in favor for this person, changes were made to the legislation, according to which Prosecutor General of the country does not have to have legal education or relevant work experience. The speed with which the Verkhovna Rada passed changes to the law about prosecutor's office from Yuri Lutsenko impressed everyone. May 12, 2016 can be considered as the day when the council set a kind of sad record. First time in the history of domestic parliamentarism when the process, which was started from the submission 1AE amendments to certain legislative acts concerning the activities of prosecutor generals, office till its adoption as a basis and in general, with the signing by the Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada, and then by the President, and with publication in Voice of Ukraine took just 2 hours and 15 minutes. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Never has the law been brought to its knees and in such a short time in Ukraine. By the way, Lutsenko was the only candidate for the post of general prosecutor. When asked in the parliamentary hall why this is the only candidate, one of the deputies of Poroshenko's BPP party said, "Was it in vain that he sat behind bars for a year and a half?" Apparently, this was a hint that the candidate for the role of the head of the GPU has his own motives to thank the prosecutors. I am convinced that Yuri Lutsenko has more moral right to demand justice. He went to the gallows for his convictions, while some deputies effectively have been cooperating with the previous government. President Poroshenko supported the dubious logic of that appointment, speaking in the Verkhovna Rada. He did not betray his convictions. Now we need a heavyweight in Prosecutor General's office who will not be guided by revenge, who will not be guided by the desire to settle scores. This will be the prosecutor, who will proceed only be led by a sense of justice. The Speaker did not add one nuance. He did not indicate that the new appointee would establish Biden-style justice. Thus, falling down of the entire system of prosecutors' offices started with Yuri Lutsenko. As the collapse of the prosecutor's office fell deeper and deeper under such general prosecutors, so too did Ruslan Ryabashapka and Irina Venediktova. I fear that we will soon see the Verkhovna Rada, which allowed the appointment of a general prosecutor without any higher education or any experience in the field of law, as it was with Yuri Lutsenko. You know, there are sacrosanct rules in the legal world that cannot be ignored, even if the country is undergoing major reform changes. The basic code of legal affairs is the so-called Bordeaux Declaration, full name, judges and prosecutors in a democratic society. The spirit and letter of this document indicate that the figure of Prosecutor General must remain the crucial one in the fight against crime. Here are some key points from this document. 134th, Victor Shack, the true stories about Titan's intermanental corruption in AR who cannot be the prudent of the United States. 1. Prosecutors must be independent and autonomous in the decision-making process and in the fair, objective, and impartial performance of their functions. 2. In order to ensure the independent status of prosecutors, it is necessary that their position and activities are not subject to influence or interference from any external source outside the prosecutorial service. 3. The prosecutor's office is an independent body, the existence of which should be based on the law at the highest possible level. In democracies, neither parliament nor government should try to make an influence for individual decisions made by prosecutors indefinite. Cases to determine how prosecution should take place in a particular case, or force prosecutors to change their decisions. I often think that such fundamental principles have not been heard in Ukraine, or does not want to. That is why such an inappropriate character as Yuri Lutsenko became the head of the GPU. It was a completely alien sphere for Lutsenko, who is an electrical engineer by education. He knew nothing and could not do anything. However, he was full of absurd bravado, that he less than memorized the criminal code during his time in prison when Viktor Yanukovych was a president, and referred to his less than experience working with law enforcement agencies and the not very effective management of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in 2005 to 2006 years. Thus, during the time of Minister Lutsenko, a huge amount of weapons and military equipment was written off from the balance of the internal troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, according to the newspaper Mirror of the Week. Only in one government decision of 2006 was it indicated that there was a write-off of 93 armored personnel carriers, 5,765 submachine guns, 100 guns, 81 Eagle manpads, 183 million rounds of ammunition. Note that it was not transferred to the armed forces of Ukraine, just written off. Yuri Lutsenko came to the prosecutor's office as an alien. Colleagues from the GPU said that the newly appointed signed the official papers without reading. Due to a lack of understanding of Yuri's professional terminology, it was difficult to understand their content. He was quietly laughed at by all prosecutors, and rumors about it circulated in Kyiv. In such cases, a smart leader usually relies on his deputies, but Lutsenko could not do that either. He strayed into personnel issues, fired almost all the deputies who worked with me, filled the vacancies with people with low. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. competence and sometimes even with a dubious reputation. Yuri Lutsenko was concentrated on several tasks he received from Biden through Poroshenko. In fact, their implementation was a prerequisite for his appointment to the position he begged for, crawling on his knees. Yuri Vitalievich completed all the set tasks successfully and quickly. First of all, he had to stop the case of money laundering by Mykola Zlochevsky and close all cases concerning Burisma. Next task, to close the case of the disappearance of the U.S. government funds allocated for the reform of the GPU, in particular in this context, was also the case against David Sakhverelidze, as well as to close the topic about Vitaly Kask's apartment. Yes, it is that Kaska, who in the 2014 allegedly missed the time for the submission of GPU materials to British investigators, because of which a court in London lifted the freezing of $23.5 million in Zlochevsky's accounts. As the investigation found out later, in 2015, Kasko used a personal electronic key to access the Unified Register of Information on Investigative and Procedural Actions of the GPU to obtain data on persons who committed serious crimes, including those which are related to politicians and party organizations. Before, in March 2014, thanks to forged documents, he took possession of some housing, which was on the balance of the GPU, an apartment of 155 square meters. As soon as he took Prosecutor General's chair, Yuri Lutsenko first sent a signal to American administrators that they need not worry about Gunter Biden's reputation, whom the GPU investigators plan to interrogate in numerous Burisma cases. Gunter Biden has not violated any Ukrainian laws. In any case, he has not violated them so far, and we have not found any violations on his part. The company can pay as much as it wants to its board members, Lutsenko said in an interview with Bloomberg in late May 2016, just 2 weeks after his appointment. By the end of the year, he will close all cases of Zlochevsky Burisma, which were investigated by the GPU. All cases, the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. And soon their main participant, as I mentioned, was removed from the internal wanted list. The decision of the GPU, which was guided by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, contained a weird justification. Due to the fact that Mykola Zlochevsky is abroad, it makes no sense to look for him inside the country. Meanwhile, in the summer of 2016, when, judging by Alexander Onishenko's films, Ihor Kononenko was conducting secret talks with Mykola Zlochevsky on behalf of Petro Poroshenko, squeezing a larger amount of resignation. Lutsenko recklessly created the scenery for this game. He revived the proceedings against the daughters of Burisma and loudly announced it to the media as his own achievements in the fight against corruption of the criminal regime of Yanukovych. Thus, on July 7th, searches were announced at the Eskopivnich office, which the GPU suspects of tax evasion of UAH 1 billion. This is a quarter of the amount allocated from the state budget for the armament of the Ukrainian army, Prosecutor General pathetically stated at a press briefing without remorse. Within few days, the court seized 20 Esko North wells. Therefore, instead of stealing state funds by Mykola Zlochevsky, money laundering, and illegal enrichment, the essence of the whole complex of Burisma cases was reduced to one episode, non-payment of taxes, and the blame was laid on the accountant of Esko North. Thus, Lutsenko received the green light to close the case as soon as Burisma pays the damage to the country's budget, which in fact happened. The billion announced by Yuri Lutsenko in the process of consideration of the case swelled to 180 million hryvnias, which Zlochevsky's company paid. Although in fact it should pay 1,000 times more. Yura, who loves to tell journalists about his successes in bright colors, this time modestly kept silent about the fact that he put an end to all cases concerning Zlochevsky Burisma. In particular, he closed the case of illegal enrichment of Mykola Zlochevsky and money laundering on November 1, 2016, with the following wording: due to the absence of a criminal offense in the activity. By the way, the two cases that we transferred to National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, in 2015 year, were also not properly investigated. In 2017, one of them, due to abuse of office during the issuance of special permits by the Ministry of Environment to private enterprises for subsoil. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine use was also closed. The head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAP, Nazar Kolodnitsky, explained that the investigation authorities did not obtain enough data to declare suspicion and to complete the proceedings. However, this is not the only high-profile case closed by General Prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko. Proceedings against other corruption crimes of Yanukovych and his government officials have not been completed. Yanukovych's case, in my time, consisted of 7 criminal proceedings, 5 of which involved corruption offenses. Still, only one of these proceedings has been completed and received a court decision. Yuri Lutsenko reported that $1.5 billion of Yanukovych's criminal organization had been returned to the state budget, and about $100 billion should be returned. As of 2020, there are no significant changes in these cases. As you know, dozens of assets were frozen or confiscated, including millions of dollars in bank accounts, luxury cars, estates, apartments, land. In almost 6 years, all this should become the property of the state. Written advice from this statesman has been preserved in my archives. In his role as head of the political faction, Yuri Lutsenko proved to be far from the best. Draw your own conclusions, whether it is corruption or not. Yuri Lutsenko asks Prosecutor General to violate the law and not to support the position in the interests of the state. Viktor Nikolaevich, a huge request. Do not go to the appeal. Yours Wifithel. 2015, the note of Yulia Lutsenko, chairman of the bloc of Petro Poroshenko faction in the parliament, with a request to the Prosecutor General to violate the law. Chapter 8. Biden in Ukraine, a global. Corruption. Joseph Biden visited Kyiv too often. 2015, 146. Victor Hakim. The true stories about Titan's international corruption in conflict of interest is the least of accusations that can be made against Joseph Biden. He lied to the press about his complete alienation from Burisma. and about the fact that he allegedly only once talked to Gunter about his work in Ukraine. By agreeing to employ his son in Burisma, the U.S. vice president was well aware that the company was created through corruption schemes. Joe Biden asked Blue Star Strategies to perform the audit. It is a company which can hardly be called impartial. By coincidence, Burisma soon signed a long-term agreement with the same company. It is easy to guess that Blue Star Strategies, despite the existence of criminal proceedings in Ukraine and the United Kingdom for laundering. Blue Star, Strategic Partnerships. Source, Chapter 8. Biden in Ukraine, a global corruption, tens of millions of dollars, gave Biden the conclusion that Burisma was operating legally. It was interesting to learn that for several years, Blue Star Strategies tried to influence the investigation of Mykola Zlochevsky. This follows from an interview with Rudolph Giuliani and Andriy Telizhenko, a former diplomat at the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, who was hired by Blue Star Strategies between the years 2016 to 2017. According to Andriy Telizhenko, his tasks included the arrangements of meetings in Ukraine, in particular with Prosecutor General. I know that Telizhenko used to work in the GPU, so obviously it was he who they asked to mediate. Discuss with the prosecutor's office the closure of the criminal case against Burisma, to show them that they are losing the case, that they should not investigate the case, they just need to release Mykola Zlochevsky and close the case, Andriy Telizhenko said in an interview to Rudolph Giuliani. The following is known from the meeting held at the GPU in March 2016. Yuri Severuk, first Deputy General Prosecutor, in his report mentioned the names of visitors from Blue Star Strategies: Karen Tramontano, Sally Painter, John Beretta. All three introduced themselves to Severuk as former employees of the True Stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, Bill Clinton administration. They were surprised that the reform of the prosecutor's office in Ukraine was assessed and presented to the U.S. public very negatively, although they were convinced that this was not. Eventually, after Yuri Lutsenko took over as general prosecutor of Ukraine, Severuk's trip to the United States was canceled to report on both Burisma and the successful reform of the GPU under General Prosecutor Victor Shokin. Note that John Beretta, the former deputy to Prosecutor General, later became an American lawyer for Burisma. On the Burisma website, you can find information about Beretta's meetings with the already new head of the GPU, Yuri Lutsenko. Is this not reason enough to believe that Joe Biden managed Prosecutor General's office with Lutsenko? I have no doubt. Vice President Biden made every effort to clear the company in which his son worked, receiving millions laundered through offshore. It is an idea that Joe Biden's personal interest was not limited to this goal, but covered the prospects to control development of all Ukrainian subsoil. Chapter 8, Tidem in Ukraine, a global corruption. In October 2014, at a time when Ukraine and the United Kingdom were already investigating criminal proceedings against Zlochevsky's illegal enrichment and money laundering through Burisma, the U.S. government agency, USAID signed a memorandum about mutual certificate. At the end of March 2016, the head of the Department of Prompta General's Chief of Ukraine, Sandertenko, informed me that 3 U.S. citizens wanted to visit me. I agreed to accept them. It turned out to be Karen Truman, Sally Painter, and John Uretra. They turned out to be representatives of the company Blue Star Strategies, and at the same time, Can Man and All Painter named that they hailed previously worked in the of their riot was Tomaton of U.S. President Khan, USA representatives in public, activists about the activates of Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine, the investigation of criminal proceedings against Lechiraki. These parents stated that they were aware that Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine had taken all actions to bring Lukinki to justice and that he'd been released BYA. Kitty, the failure of law enforcement agencies, 10-1, M United. One, thanked these representatives for ACH enactment of the ITT of the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine, and acquainted them with the resuscity of the form of the Prosecutor's Office, including those posted in the Webet Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. These people were surprised by the information and proposed that the U.S. State Department disseminated completely different information about the failure of the Ukrainian Prosecutor's Office Reforma. But after reviewing the material, they realized that the information disseminated was invalid and said they would inst my trip to the U.S. to prove the truth information in the heads of the State Department. This vast was being prepared but canceled after the nomination of Lutko TV to the portion of Peter General of Ukraine. Addition, copies of Bessanese candy of the specified person provided to me during the meeting. The Pronkut General at Ukramayet, the time of the band trip Ryserk National Academy of Proctors of Ukram Sek, March 2016. The report of First Deputy of Prosecutor General E. Severuk about the visit of Blue Star Strategies, representatives to the GPU, the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, understanding with the company on municipal energy reform. Joe Biden shaped the political mainstream of American policy toward Ukraine and was therefore the first and the last instance to which the new Ukrainian government turned to for advice or money. When the president of a plundered, war-torn country sees you as a high priest, it's hard to resist the temptation to interfere in its internal affairs and receive dividends from it, not just political ones. All this was covered by beautiful slogans about the development of democracy, support for Ukraine at a difficult time, and of course, the interest of America. Although apparently Joseph Biden was guided primarily by his own selfish interests, the president of Ukraine received from Biden valuable instructions on certain appointments to the government and law enforcement agencies. Joe Biden also told Poroshenko about the fashion trend, foreigners in key positions. In 2015, Mikhail Saakashvili's candidacy was considered for the post of Prime Minister of Ukraine in a serious way. However, the daring idea of taking control of the entire Ukrainian government failed, so Saakashvili was appointed to lead the promising Odessa region. and the lion's share of American funds for technical assistance went to Odessa. The $7 million allocated to justice reform was lost, and Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine instituted March 16, 2016 criminal proceeding. In 2 weeks after his appointment, Yuri Lutsenko illegally closed this proceeding. The United States has also recently reported millions of dollars as an aid to Ukraine for reforms in other areas. Most of these funds were not used for their intended purpose, but settled in the pockets of Ukrainian pseudo-reformers and public organizations. Thus, the GPU confirmed the facts that $2 million had been transferred to the accounts of the Center for Combating Corruption, headed by Daria Kalenyuk and Vitaly Shabunin, and on August 7, 2020. A corruption report had been drawn up against Shabunin. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. It was Biden who imposed the vertical hierarchy in Ukraine, allegedly a system of anti-corruption bodies. From what I learned from conversations with Petro Poroshenko, the U.S. vice president gave the final verdict on whether a particular candidate would head these institutions. Thus, the system operated in manual mode, which was intended to keep Ukrainian politicians, government officials, and businessmen on the hook. The closure of cases against Burisma is evidence that such a mission was fulfilled by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. As can be seen from my personal experience, Joe Biden could easily have fired a Ukrainian government official if he wanted to. Blackmailing Petro Poroshenko by refusing to provide financial assistance as if it were his own money, not that of American taxpayers. Alexander Mereshko, the current vice president of PACE, People's Deputy from the Servant of the People faction, doctor of law, professor in Ukraine and Poland, made a scientific and legal conclusion. See pages 154 to 160. Interfering in the internal affairs of Ukraine, keeping its leadership hooked on the donor's needle, Biden felt absolute impunity and went beyond what was appropriate. In particular, he conducted a special operation at the hands of Ukrainians in order to discredit his political opponent, Donald Trump, on the eve of the U.S. election. The so-called Barn Book of the Party of Regions, a secret notebook in which is recorded the amount of black cash allocated for political purposes, including a staggering fee for Paul Manafort, head of Trump's election headquarters, was released in 2016. Someone in Ukraine kept these materials, apparently obtained in 2014, after Yanukovych's escape, in order to sell it by a high price at a convenient time. In this case, the beneficiary of the deal was Joseph Biden, and the black accounting of the Yanukovych party was published with the knowledge of President Poroshenko. At least confirmation of this very logical assumption can be found in the recordings of Poroshenko's telephone conversations, which were recently published by Deputy Andriy Derkach. Here's what they say. Petro Poroshenko, and one more thing, just a joke. We have published the documents of the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. International Law Association. Ukrainian Brock. 36B, Yevena Konovaltsa, St. Letter A2, 3rd floor, Kyiv, 01133. Ukraine Tel. 38,044 to 377, 77 to 60. Charles Clore House. 17 Russell Square, London, WC1B5DR, United Kingdom Tel. 440-207-323297. March 18, 2017 year. Approved President of the Branch of the Public Non-Governmental Organization Association of International Law in Ukraine. Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary Candidate of Law Okupchishin. The branch of the Public Non-Governmental Organization Association of International Law in Ukraine was asked to provide an expert legal opinion by the law firm Aktio Law Firm, which, referring to paragraph 10 of the first part of Article 20 of the Law of Ukraine on Advocacy, asked to receive written opinion of a scientific and legal expert on the doctrinal interpretation from the standpoint of international law. Given the subject matter of the question posed by the applicant, in accordance with the regulations on the office, the said request of the Bar Association was sent to one of the leading lawyers. Internationalist of Ukraine, Doctor of Law, Professor O. Mereshko. Scientific and legal conclusion of the Director of Legal Sciences, O. Mereshko, which explains the interference of U.S. Vice President J. Biden in the internal affairs of Ukraine, April 18, 2017, P1, Chapter 8. Biden in Ukraine, A Global Corruption. Information about the scientific expert, Mereshko Alexander Alexandrovich, Specialty International Law Professor, Head of the Department of Law, Kyiv National Linguistic University, Professor of the Academy. Andrzej Frisch-Modjeski, Krakow, Poland. Author of 17 monographs and more than 200 other scientific publications on current issues of international law. Mereshko. Alexander Alexandrovich has the right to conduct scientific examinations in the field of international law, in accordance with the law of Ukraine on scientific and scientific technical expertise of February 10, 1995. No 5195, VR, paragraph 2 of paragraph 3 point, of the Procedure for State Accreditation of Individuals and Legal Entities, Scientific and Scientific Technical Examination, approved by the order of the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine of January 12, 2004, not 12, registered with the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine on January 26, 2004 for 110, 8,709ths. First, the content of the request and the question. The law firm Aktio Law Firm reported that in accordance with the agreement on the provision of legal and legal consequences, it protects the client's interest in the case of declaring illegal and revoking decisions of state authorities of Ukraine and renewing them administratively. This case is considered according to the rules of administrative procedure by the Supreme Administrative Court of Ukraine. The requested conclusion of the scientific and legal examination of the applicant considers necessary for the proper implementation of the contract for legal assistance. In order to provide the conclusion of the scientific and legal examination, the Bar Association asked the following question. It is a well-known fact that numerous cases of pressure by officials of foreign states on officials of Ukraine in order to achieve certain political and/or economic results. One of such cases in particular, scientific and legal conclusion of the Director of Legal Sciences Omareshko, which explains the interference of U.S. Vice President Joe Biden in the internal affairs of Ukraine, April 18, 2017, P2, 155. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine is mentioned in the material of the publication The Atlantic. The material is available on the internet at the link http://theatlantic.com/international/archive/2016/08/Biden doctrine/4966841. Is it a violation of international law that such statements of the Vice President of a foreign state, namely statements on the provision of financial or economic assistance by the state, given that Prosecutor General of Ukraine should be removed from the post for that assistance? Second, in drawing up this conclusion, the following regulations, documents, and materials were studied and analyzed. 1. Charter of the United Nations of June 26, 1945. 2. Declaration on the inadmissibility of interference in the internal affairs of states on the protection of their independence and sovereignty, adopted on December 21, 1965 by Resolution 2131XX at the 20th session of the UN General Assembly. 3. International Law Course, Volume 2, Basic Principles of International Law. Executive Editor of the volume II, Lukashuk, M. Science, 1989. 4. Lukashuk, II International Law. A Common Part, Textbook, M. Publishing House, Beck, 1996. The Biden Doctrine, Internet Access at the link, Biden Doctrine. Third description of the study. Analysis of regulations and other materials. Results and conclusions. One of the oldest and most respectable American publications, Atlantic, contains a reference to a conversation between U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden Jr. and President of Ukraine Petro Poroshenko as follows, he that is Joseph Biden. Scientific and legal conclusion of the Director of Legal Sciences Omareshko, which explains the interference of U.S. Vice President Joe Biden in the internal affairs of Ukraine, April 18, 2017, P3, Chapter 8. Biden in Ukraine, a global corruption, OM, described, for example, a meeting with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, whom he calls Petro, in which he urged Poroshenko to fire a corrupt prosecutor general or see the withdrawal of a promised $1 billion loan to Ukraine. Petro, you are not getting your $1 billion, Biden recalled telling him. It's okay, you can keep the prosecutor general. Just understand, we're not paying if you do. Poroshenko fired the official. It is a well-known fact that the result of this conversation was the dismissal of VM Shokin from the post of Prosecutor General of Ukraine, after which Ukraine received $1 billion from the United States. In analyzing this case, it should be taken into consideration that this conversation took place between the Vice President of the United States, who represented the United States, on the one hand, and the President of Ukraine on the other. If there was an agreement between the United States and Ukraine on the release of VM Shokin from the post of Prosecutor General of Ukraine, the question arises as to whether such an agreement can be considered U.S. interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine in terms of the basic principle of international law on non-interference in the internal affairs of each other. At the same time, we are faced with the question of the meaning of the concept of intervention. It should be noted that the Soviet and post-Soviet doctrines of international law state that these are any measures taken by states or by the United Nations which impede the free and scientific and legal conclusion of the Director of Legal Sciences Omareshko, which explains the interference of U.S. Vice President Joe Biden in the internal affairs of Ukraine, April 18, 2017, P4, 157. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Unimpeded resolution of matters which are, in essence, within the internal competence of any state. Based on this, it can be argued that first, such issues like an appointment and dismissal of Prosecutor General of Ukraine, of course, fall within the competence of Ukraine. Secondly, the actions of the Vice President of the United States in the form of a statement to the withdrawal of a promised $1 billion loan actually became a real obstacle for Ukraine's leadership to decide freely and without hindrance on such an item, as VM Shokin being Prosecutor General of Ukraine. It should be noted that during that time, Ukraine was experiencing a difficult economic situation due to the war and the financial crisis, which could not but affect its willingness to make concessions in the issue of Shokin in the position as General Prosecutor of Ukraine. It should be added that, according to the UN Declaration of 1965 on the inadmissibility of interference in the internal affairs of states, the protection of their independence and sovereignty, no state can neither apply nor encourage the use of economic, political, or other measures to compel another state to subjugate the exercise of its sovereign rights or to obtain any advantage from it. This UN document, which reveals the content of the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of states, also contains a categorical and fairly broad prohibition of interference. Professor Tsekin Lukashuk, in the context of his analysis of the principle of non-interference, writes, if we talk about this type of direct intervention as economic, which has become widespread, it consists of such scientific and legal conclusion of the Director of Legal Sciences Omareshko, which explains the interference of U.S. Vice President Joe Biden in the internal affairs of Ukraine, April, P. Serious measures as economic blockade, cessation of trade relations in a significant amount, refusal to implement large programs of economic and technical assistance. As we can see, the refusal of the United States to implement a large program of economic assistance to Ukraine in the event that Ukraine does not take certain actions that fall within its internal competence can be seen as interference in the internal affairs of the state. Thus, on the basis of this information, it can be argued that, first, U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden demanded that the resignation of the then Attorney General VM, Shokin. Secondly, in the difficult economic and political conditions in which Ukraine was at the time, the provision of such economic assistance by the United States was of great importance to Ukraine. Thirdly, such demands, voiced by U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden, speaking on behalf of the United States, concerned Ukraine's internal competence, its sovereign rights. In particular, Ukraine's sovereign right to decide who should be the Attorney General of Ukraine. Based on the above, it can be argued that the initiator of the release of VM Shokin from the administrative position of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine was not the President of Ukraine, not the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, i.e. not the state bodies of Ukraine, but U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden, whose actions and statements should be considered as actions on behalf of the United States. Thus, we make a reasonable conclusion that the statement of U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden regarding the need to dismiss the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, VM Shokin, as a condition for providing Ukraine with appropriate financial assistance can be seen as putting pressure on the President of Ukraine, and therefore, scientific and legal conclusion of the Director of Legal Sciences, Omereshko, which explains the interference of U.S. Vice President J. Biden in the internal affairs of Ukraine, April 18, 2017, P6. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. This pressure can be qualified as an act of interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine by a foreign state, which is a violation of one of the principles of international law. Doctor of Law, Professor, Head of the Department of Law, Kyiv National University, Ukraine, Professor of the Academy, Andrzej Majewski, Krakow, Poland, Omereshko. Scientific and legal conclusion of the Director of Legal Sciences, Omereshko, which explains the interference of U.S. Vice President J. Biden in the internal affairs of Ukraine, April 18, 2017, PE7, the former Party of Regents. As I understand it, one of Mr. Trump's key advisors, Paul Manafort, resigned today. Joe Biden, yes. I think he will go to Russia. Back, I do not know. Petro Poroshenko. In my opinion, it was a bad idea to take Yanukovych's advisor to Trump's team, the deputy Serhiy Leshchenko, who presented the Party of Regents' secret notebooks to the world, had contacts with Washington politicians when he was an investigative journalist for the Ukrainian Pravda online publication. Of course, he did not inform the investigation about the origin of Barn Book, nor the customers of this leaked information. Soon it became clear that the deputy head of the SBU, Viktor Tripak, was involved, as well as the NABU director, Artem Sitnik, supported by Biden. Very soon, Leshchenko bought an apartment in the center of Kyiv for a sum inconsistent with his income, $1 million. In the sale contract, I saw that paragraph 10 stated the funds belonged to him personally, were not loaned or borrowed. When investigators became interested in the origin of the money for the apartment, the lover of truth explained that he had borrowed money from his civilian wife and a former colleague. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. The investigation did not last long, less than 3 months. After heading the GPU, Yuri Lutsenko immediately closed the case which favored Biden. I know that the closure of Serhiy Leshchenko's case was one of the conditions for Lutsenko's appointment as the Prosecutor General. It should be noted that information for Joe Biden's personal interests was collected not only through unofficial channels and through Joe Biden's proxies in Ukraine, but also through government agencies. In less than 2 years, in 2014 to 2015, 56 working meetings of the heads of investigative units of Prosecutor General's office with representatives of the FBI took place in the GPU office. Both the Ukrainian and American sides initiated the meetings. It was mainly about cooperation in the investigation of criminal proceedings against high-ranking Yanukovych officials for embezzlement, illicit enrichment, abuse of office, and so on. The Americans were interested, in particular, in the presence of the offender and his relatives' real estate, monetary assets, including abroad, the numbers of these accounts and the names of banking institutions, data on the movement of funds in the accounts. The contract of sale of the apartment. Kyiv, the 31st of August, year 2016. We, the limited liability company of an asset management company, Industrial Investments, taxpayer code according to USRIU 33,640,219, location 04053, Kyiv, Nestorovsky Lane, Building 9. Date and number of entry in the Unified State Register of Legal Entities and Individuals of Enterprises on state registration. On August 15, 2005, noon 071102000000, 30,123. Acting in the interests and at the expense of the Mutual Venture Investment Fund construction and investment of non-diversified closed type. Idrisi code 2,331,530. On the basis of the law of Ukraine, on joint investment institutions unit and corporate investments of the fund, represented by the director of the Citizen of Ukraine, Oleksandr Yevenovich Porshakov. Identification number 22427068858. Passport SN 250-4253, issued by the Kharkiv Regional Department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine in Kyiv, on August 20th, 1996, hereinafter referred to as seller on the one hand, and citizen of Ukraine, Leshchenko, Serhiy Anatolyovich, identification number 29,462,098,161, passport C, no 428,680, issued by the Podolsk Regional Department of the Main Directorate of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine in Kyiv, on March 13th, 1997, place of residence registered at Kyiv, St. Turiska, House No 1820, apartment No 4 hereinafter referred to as buyer on the other hand, and jointly named parties, acting voluntarily and with a clear mind, understanding the meaning of their actions. Previously acquainted with the notary with the provisions of civil law transactions concluded by us in particular with the requirements for the invalidity of the transaction. Have concluded this agreement on the following. 1. The seller transfers ownership, and the buyer takes ownership of real estate, which is apartment No 1111 in the house No 1111 on Franka Ivana Street, Shevchenkivsky district in Kyiv. 2. 3. The apartment consists of 4 rooms, total area 192 SQM, living area 130.20, 130 whole 20 square meters. M7. Purchase and sale agreement for S. Lashenko's apartment, August 31st, 2016, P1. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, 8, 9, 10. Serhiy Lashenko buyer brought to the attention of the Director Limited Liability Asset Management Company Industrial Investments, Parshakova Alexander E. Sellers, at the time of conclusion of the contract. He is not married, and no one lives as one family without marriage. Money spent for the purchase of an apartment is his personal private property. 11. This agreement is made in 3 copies, one of which is kept in the files of a private notary of the Kyiv City Notarial District Chorny Vervith, and others are issued to the parties. Signatures, seller, represented by the Director of Asset Management Company Industrial Investments, Parshakov Alexander Yevinovich, buyer, Lashenko Serhiy Anatolyovich. This agreement was certified by me, VV Chorny, a private notary of the Kyiv City Notarial District. The contract was signed by the parties in my presence. Citizens signed the agreement, established their legal capacity, as well as the legal capacity of Asset Management Company Industrial Investments, Ltd., and the authorized representative in ownership of Asset Management Company Industrial Investments, Ltd., alienated property. Apartments checked. Registered in the register for no private notary. Purchase and sale agreement for S. Lashenko's apartment, August 31st, 2016, P2. Of Yanukovych officials and related companies in foreign jurisdictions, involvement in the offenses of foreign companies, etc. The Americans have expressed a desire to gain access to all materials of criminal proceedings, including restricted and secret. At the same time, when the Ukrainian side requested assistance in compiling or verifying classified specific data, these requests were ignored, or formal replies or outdated information were sent. We provided the FBI without delay with detailed information about the fugitive president, his son Alexander, and the young oligarch Kurchenko he created, through whose group of companies SEPEC, Ukraine's resources were diverted. They shared full information about the head of the National Bank Arbuzov, Prime Minister Azarov, the head of the Yanukovych administration, the head of the tax inspection Klemenko, the head of Naftogaz Kolobov, and many others. Information on Zlochevsky was also provided. As for the cases against Zlochevsky, 4 working meetings of our investigators and FBI representatives took place. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, certificate on cooperation between the Office of Investigation of Particularly Important Cases and the Department of Special Investigations of the Main Investigation Department of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the U.S. Department of Justice, Kyiv, July 28, 2015. The study of the state and results of cooperation in 2014 to 2015 of the investigative units of the Main Investigation Department of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine with representatives of the FBI of the U.S. Department of Justice established the following. During this time, the heads and investigators of the GSU units in the premises of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, 1315 Rezhnitska Street, 18 Borisoglebska Street, 8 Moskovska Street, held 56 working meetings between the American and the Ukrainian representatives, in cooperation and international assistance in investigations by Ukrainian investigators of topical and high-profile criminal proceedings against ex-high-ranking Ukrainian officials for embezzlement, illicit enrichment, abuse of office, etc., as well as for investigations of crimes against participants in the Revolution of Dignity. These working meetings were held for 17 criminal proceedings of this category. During meetings by Ukrainian investigators in accordance with the requirements of current legislation of Ukraine, Article 222 of the CPC of Ukraine and Article 8 of the Law of Ukraine on state secrets, mostly at the oral request of the U.S., provided comprehensive information on the status and results of pretrial investigation in these criminal proceedings, in particular regarding circumstances of the investigated crimes, persons of offenders, notifications to them about suspicion, and legal qualification of their actions. Available information about the property belonging to ex-high-ranking officials, their relatives on the territory of Ukraine and abroad, including bank accounts, real estate, vehicles, as well as entities and business entities, foreign companies. Persons and companies connected by their offenders, including abroad. Possible stay in foreign jurisdictions of criminally acquired assets. Available information on the latest possible whereabouts of wanted ex-senior officials and related persons. Reference working version on the cooperation of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine with the U.S. FBI. July 28, 2015, page 1. In most cases, the FBI inquired about the involvement of specific ex-officials in criminal offenses, their procedural status, suspicion, the adequacy and validity of the evidence, the offender and his relatives' real estate and monetary assets, including in foreign countries, numbers and names of banking institutions, identification of foreign companies or related companies belonging to ex-senior officials, availability of data on cash flows in the accounts of ex-senior officials and related companies in foreign jurisdictions, involvement in foreign companies' offenses, and information on the latter. Ukrainian investigators provided the requested information to the FBI during meetings without concealment or delay, except in isolated cases where the requested information was a state investigative secret or the disclosure of certain facts could actually impede and prompt a comprehensive investigation. In such circumstances, the information was provided as much as possible Exceptions were materials marked DSC, secret, etc. For example, the FBI provided the Ukrainian side with the most complete relevant information about Yanukovych VF, Yanukovych OV, Arbuzov SG, Kekorchenko SV, Kekliueva AP, Kilyueva SP, Zlochevsky MV, Stavitsky AA, Klemenko OV, Kolobova YV, Azarova MI, Azarova Bogatyreeva RV, and other ex-officials and related with him persons. Several times during these meetings, FBI representatives expressed their intentions to study the materials of specific Ukrainian criminal proceedings or certain procedural documents in them, in particular regarding Arbuzov SG, Kerchenko SV, Zlochevsky MV, Yanukovych VF, Kolobova YV, and other ex-officials and related persons. No objections were raised by Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors in this regard. Instead, the FBI never reviewed specific procedural documents of criminal proceedings precisely because of their own position and lack of initiative, limiting themselves to the Ukrainian investigative information and oral information provided. Reference working version on the cooperation of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine with the U.S. FBI, July 28, 2015, page 2, 168. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, or who cannot be the president of the Hilted States. For reference, the financial investigator Malist of the International Center for Asset Recovery of the Base Institute of Management, Patrick Gill. A permanent base since the end of 2014 is freely acquainted with this. Materials of criminal proceedings in the main investigation department of the Prosecutor General's Office. The American side has never indicated the incompleteness or refusal the Ukraine side to provide informati. During 2011 and early 2015, the American side repeatedly expressed its position on providing the Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine with computer equipment and EBL specialists at the expense of the U.S. government to copy all criminal proceedings investigated by the main Inwongation Department, the purpose of the American Dewat Te Gam, access to all materials of criminal proceedings of the main investigation department of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, including restricted and secret. The Ukrainian side agreed to receive and install this equipment, as well as to involve FL specialists in copying the materials, but inly subject to the requirements of the law on non-hacklor of the secrets of the investigation and protectium UF state secrets. The last meeting this occasion took place in January 2015. No further proposals were received from the FRI. At the same time, the analysis AF, the results at WIC with representatives at the FBI revealed that this corporation on the part of the American side is not effective enough. It is not marked by completeness and timelines. In most CAM, these international events by the FBI were limited to an disinf the results and achievements Crimean society. The FBI did not provide specific suggestions and assistance regarding the circumstances and methods of conducting a pre-trial investigations in criminal proceedings of this category, including the implementation of joint investigative measures. They only expressed general advice and less the procedural measures already taken. It should be noted that in the event that Ukrainian MV Vatikatan requested stance in compiling or verifying specific data by the FME, they responded with formal replies or information. Reference working version on the cooperation of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine with the U.S. FBI. July 28, 2015, page 3, within Prosecutor General's Office. Thus, approximately in a 6-month period, through his agents of influence, Joseph Biden became a dominion over the whole of Ukraine, both secretly and openly. He has entered our domestic and foreign policies, and even in our losses I see the shadow of Biden's hand. I mean the Peninsula Crimean lost by Ukraine. I am 100% sure that the tactics of non-resistance during the annexation of Crimea were also imposed on Ukraine by curator Joe Biden. At the beginning of Russia's special operation, in the 22nd of February 2014, our troops had to and could repel the aggressor. They were waiting for instructions from official Kyiv, but the order never came. I know for sure that Petro Poroshenko, as one of the leaders of the then democratic opposition, and Oleksandr Turchinov, the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, at that time he was the acting head of state, turned to Biden in those days for advice. What should we do? Russia really captures Crimea. Biden then forbade Kyiv to resist resolutely. His behavior allowed Russia to seize Crimea without a single shot and thus launch a military operation in the Donbass. Alexander Turchinov still ignored this topic, remained silent, and only in 2020 talked about the advice he received from Victor Shokin. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, or who cannot be the president of the United States. Washington in late February 2014. Here is a quote from his speech in Portland. You know that Ukraine once had nuclear weapons. In addition, voluntarily got rid of it under pressure from the West in 1993 to 1994. Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom have acted as guarantors of our security by signing the Budapest Memorandum. They said, you do not need any nuclear weapons. We guarantee that Ukraine's territorial integrity will last forever. And one of the guarantors attacked our state. I turned to the President of the United States and said that we had been attacked and that we needed your help. We have signed agreements with you. And he sent me Vice President Biden and Secretary of State Kerry, who explained me that the Budapest Memorandum was a purely political declaration and had no obligations. That is, the weapons were real. Ukraine had the third nuclear potential in the world. We were not afraid of any enemy. No one would dare to attack Ukraine. Then loans were needed and resources were needed. Nobody thought they would have to fight and defend the country, and we easily gave up the weapon, on paper, which, as it turned out, was worthless. In 2014, they said, Mr. President, we respect you, we love you, and we will help you. At the diplomatic level, the Ukrainian authorities missed our Crimea precisely because of such advice. Chapter 9. NABU, or Biden's Supervisory Agency in Ukraine. NABU in the shadow of American curators. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, Biden's supervisory agency for Ukraine. Unfortunately, I decipher the abbreviation NABU in this manner. Undoubtedly, Ukraine had to fight corruption proactively, which by 2014 had grown to the level of a threat to national security. I think the threat has not diminished today. However, the anti-corruption bodies artificially created under Biden's direction could not cope with this overriding task. NABU is a whim of Mr. Biden's. The goal was to control all serious cases against top Ukrainian politicians and businessmen, to keep them on the hook and to pursue Ukraine's own interests, including business interests. Why was I a strong opponent of the idea of creating NABU from the beginning? Because first, it is a fictional neoplasm that has no absolute analog in any Western country. Secondly, I am annoyed when my country is not offered, but rather has imposed upon it, a matrix of decisions and actions about issues that it is capable to resolve by itself, and even to give advice on such matters. Finally, the main reason is that these artificial bodies implanted in U.S. duplicate the functions of other law enforcement agencies, thus confusing the legal field and is unnecessary competition in the very fight against corruption, which in the absence of a proper legal culture looks extremely pathetic. The Code of Criminal Procedure of Ukraine, adopted by the Verkhovna Rada in 2012, CCP.
By the way, it takes into account the recommendations of the Venice Commission and Ukraine's commitments to the Council of Europe.
Provided for the establishment of a 3-year State Bureau of Investigation, SBI, to investigate top corruption. It was a purely Ukrainian project. Moreover, unlike NABU, it is clearly inscribed in the legal field of Ukraine. Going back to the recent past, I would like to note that the only, although doubtful, advantage of NABU is that it was created faster than the SBI, which was deliberately blocked further repeatedly by the CCP of Ukraine, even up to the last day of its creation. Biden's supervisory agency for Ukraine was quickly and literally forced into our reality. The law, which provided for the establishment of NABU, was passed through the Parliament of Ukraine on October 14, 2014. And 6 months later, on April, the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. November 16, 2015, the Bureau was announced and ready to operate. 5 years have passed, and the results of this activity, as we see, point to zero. Poroshenko did not care whether there would be an effect from the new anti-corruption body or not. He was in a hurry to please Biden, so he pushed for the creation of NABU. The competition for the position of head was announced. 2 people reached the final of the competitive selection, a well-known lawyer, a lecturer at the Institute of State and Law, Mykola Siri, and Artem Sitnik. I supported Siri because I know Sitnik quite well for his work as the head of the investigative department of the Kyiv Regional Prosecutor's Office in the 1990s. In those days, hundreds of shares were illegally being reissued in hundreds of hectares of the capital's Kyiv region. These cases were even prosecuted. In addition, it is known that in 2008, Sitnik, using his official position, by putting pressure on a developer, received an apartment in a new building in Brovary, for which he paid only a meager part of its value. The rest was donated to him by the Free Community Charitable Foundation. As a result, the Rivne court found Sitnik guilty of the offense. In fact, found the future director of NABU corrupt and imposed an administrative penalty with confiscation of gifts. Based on this court decision, Sitnik was entered in the register of corrupt officials of Ukraine. Where else have you seen such a leader chosen in the fight against corruption? In short, I was quite surprised when the next morning it became known that the position of NABU director was held not by Siri, but by Sitnik. Subsequently, on August 28, 2000, at the time of my completion of this book, the Constitutional Court of Ukraine declared the decree of the President of Ukraine, Petro, on the basis of the stated, being guided by Article 23 of the Law of Ukraine about prevention of corruption, a part of Article 172-5, resolved Sitnik Artem Serhiovich to be found guilty of committing an offense under Article 1 of Article 172-5 of the Code of Administrative Offenses, to impose on Sitnik Artem Serhiovich an administrative penalty in the form of a fine in the amount of 200 non-taxable minimum incomes of citizens, amounting to UAH 3,400 to 3,400, 000 pennies, with confiscation of gifts to state revenue, to collect from Sitnik Artem Serhiovich a court fee in the amount of UAH 384.20. The decision may be appealed to the Rivne Court of Appeal through the Court of First Instance within 10 days from the date of issuance. Judge Riji Owe. Resolution of the Sarny District Court on the commission of a corruption offense. September 6, 2019. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Poroshenko, on appointment of a Sitnik director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine of April 16, 2015. Despite this, Artem Sitnik still remains in office and continues to lead NABU. Subsequently, on September 16, 2020, the Constitutional Court of Ukraine declared unconstitutional the provisions of the law on the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine in particular, regarding the powers of the President of Ukraine to establish this body. This shows once again that in favor of U.S. Vice President Biden, an unconstitutional body with 2 broad powers has been operating in Ukraine for almost 5 years. Such things as the unconstitutional formations of NABU, the unconstitutionality of the appointment of its reciter, seriously undermine the legitimacy of our state. However, Mr. Biden does not care. However, let us go back to history. From the very beginning, Joe Biden sent his people to NABU, first of all, Gizo Uglava, who was appointed first deputy director. 2 non-staff FBI agents, Biden's men, sat permanently in the Bureau under the guise of consultants. Because of them, the U.S. Embassy kept their finger on the pulse of all events in NABU. No case came out of NABU without the approval of Biden's people. The leaders of the new anti-corruption bodies were selected, as I mentioned, through competitive procedures, but the final approval of the candidacy remained with Joe Biden. Yes, few people know that Roman Govda, the then deputy head of the department at the GPU, won the competition for the head of the CP. However, his appointment was blocked by Biden, who preferred to see Vitaly Kaska as the head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAP. The implication was clear: either appoint Kaska and remove Govda. Annoyed, Petro Poroshenko called me, "What are we going to do?" Govda cannot be appointed, although he won the competition. But how to appoint Kaska, I asked, if he completely failed in the competition? Then they found a compromise to remove both Govda and Kaska from the competition. The choice was between Nazar Kolodnitsky and Maxim Hryshchuk. After talking to both of them, I was struck by Grishchuk's unprofessionalism. Apparently, he managed to pass the competition largely due to the status of a participant in the anti-terrorist operation. Before the war, Grishchuk worked as the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, assistant prosecutor in the Lviv region, and was engaged in juvenile justice, that is, in the field of anti-corruption investigations. He had no experience. Absolutely zero. Nazar Kolodnitsky, who had real work experience, stood out against Hryshchuk, so he headed the SAP. Thanks to a massive media campaign, anti-corruption bodies were presented to Ukrainians as the best experience of a democratic world. However, no Western country has such bodies, or they are created for a certain period for specific tasks. In Ukraine, NABU and SAP settled indefinitely. Instead of the results of their work, they demonstrate competition for power with other law enforcement agencies, shamefully watch and illegally wiretap each other, and, as a result of this mutual competition to the level of mutual destruction. It seems that so far, NABU and SAP have not only discredited themselves in the eyes of the Ukrainian public, but have also burned in the fire of the civil war of their very goal, the anti-corruption struggle and its results. By the way, the real gap in our legislation is that it was not specified who should act as the head of the SAP in case of their removal from work, death, or serious illness. Apparently, in a nightmare, they could not think that someone could replace the specially selected and fully controlled heads of these bodies. Meanwhile, Ukrainian taxpayers continue to fund an inactive structure that works in the interests of Joe Biden and without significant benefit to the people of Ukraine. Chapter 10. Georgian paratrooper. From Biden, Saakashvili, Saakashvili, and the missing millions of dollars. For reform. David Saakashvili left and Mikhail Saakashvili center are some of the leading representatives of the Georgian Landing Party thrown into Kyiv by Biden. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. I will say at once, I did not, and still do not welcome the appointment of foreigners in important key positions in the authorities or in state-owned companies of Ukraine. In my opinion, even those foreigners who have a successful experience of transformation in their homeland in another country can only act as advisors or consultants, but cannot be ministers, prosecutors, or judges. Note that in 2014 to 2015, almost all staffing proposals for the Ukrainian government were approved by Biden. Only Georgians were offered to law enforcement agencies. It was Biden who was behind the landing of Georgian rulers in Kyiv. They were personally indebted to him and were under his political patronage since Saakashvili's presidency in Georgia. The most prominent and well-known of the Georgian reformers was Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia. A poser and a talker, he managed to please ordinary Ukrainians with his fiery revolutionary rhetoric. I will tell only one case from Saakashvili's activities hidden from the human eye, from which it will become clear what is really behind his reform thirst. If you remember, in 2015, when Saakashvili was the head of the Odessa Regional State Administration, he poured a lot of unfounded accusations against Prosecutor General's office. Poroshenko decided to introduce us so that we could talk in person and understand each other. The meeting took place on Bankova Street in the president's office. Poroshenko gave Saakashvili his first word, and he began to talk long, pathetically, and about nothing. It was unpleasant that he addressed me casually, without respect, even though the age difference between us is almost 2 decades. I listened carefully to the speech of our Georgian guest, and then clearly explained to Saakashvili what the violation of Ukrainian law will lead to, and I went away. After that, there was no more negativity from Saakashvili. He understood me. In the same year, 2015, Biden imposed upon Ukraine another pseudo-reformer, former deputy of General Prosecutor of Georgia, David Saakashvili. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. In the first days of my work as General Prosecutor, Poroshenko offered to talk to Georgians who came to us to make reforms, and waiting for an audience in the office of Shokin was the head of the presidential administration. We need to take one of them to Prosecutor General's office. The Americans believe that these people are progressive, and they will help us, Poroshenko explained. I noted that foreigners should not be taken into the law enforcement sphere because they do not know the Ukrainian language or our legislation, and despite all their probable professional virtues. This alone is already reason enough to doubt their qualifications. Moreover, Georgia is incomparable with Ukraine, for example. In terms of population, it is only slightly larger than Kyiv. But Poroshenko did not want to listen to any arguments, because, I realized later, Saakashvili's employment in the GPU had already been agreed with Joe Biden. Boris Shokin met me at the entrance to his office and immediately stunned me with the following. The Americans have an idea to appoint one of these Georgians as your deputy. I have professional deputies, I said, and I'm not going to replace anyone. So create another position of deputy for reforms, Boris proposed. I had to agree, but I demanded the visitors share their vision of these reforms, explain exactly what they want to change, and describe how the expected results. Of the group of Georgian prosecutors, David Saakashvili spoke the most, from which I concluded that his American friends saw him as my deputy for reforms. David began his presentation of reforms with the idea of eliminating turnstiles at the entrance to the GPU building, re-equipping the entrance in general, and making it glass, which should symbolize the transparency of the renewed General Prosecutor's office. I was even a little angry. Do you realize what you are saying? We have investigators working on particularly important cases here. At any moment, anyone can come and kill them. We are a warring country. We are guarded by the police, and even the UDO are not without a reason. We will install bulletproof glass, David reassured. This was his level of understanding of reforms. I asked where from the money for the glazing of the GPU would come and any other such whimsical initiatives. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Saakashvili waved his hand. It will be there. We are treated very well in America. It was agreed that he would bring me a sketch of the plan, what the entrance to the GPU would look like, and how the security of our employees would be ensured. But when the door closed behind the Georgian comrades, I directly expressed my thoughts to Boris Shokin, the head of the administration of the president of Ukraine. I do not see any of these Georgians in any role in the GPU. They went to Poroshenko with this. But he insisted, this is a requirement of the IMF. What does the IMF have to do with the GPU's internal reshuffle? You see, if we do not follow their instructions, we will not be given the money, Poroshenko urged. Reform of the prosecutor's office and recruitment is an internal affair, I objected. Besides, I have not heard that the activities of the National Prosecutor's Office were the responsibility of the IMF. But what can you do? I did not manage to convince the president, so I was forced to accept Saakashvili into Prosecutor General's office and create a position for him, Deputy for Reform. He was appointed to this position on February 16, 2015, and 6 days after my appointment. Soon I realized that David was acquainted much better with the U.S. Embassy than with his GPU colleagues. Around March, during a working meeting with Ambassador Jeffrey Payette, Saakashvili entered the room, shook hands with the ambassador, and talked briefly like good acquaintances. Addressing me and pointing to Saakashvili, the ambassador commented majestically, "This is a man who is highly respected by the American people." I could not resist and asked, "And what did he do for the American people?" I added, "He had to flee his own country." Payette seems to be offended. By the way, the SBU did not give Saakashvili access to state secrets. He does not have such access today, as evidenced by the document that you can see in this book. I noticed that the Georgian reformer could not read or speak Ukrainian. I do not understand how he was acquainted with the laws and all official documents, which were exclusively in the state language. It seems that Saakashvili has so far been unable or unwilling to master Ukrainian. However, the new deputy for reforms, the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, sought not only to initiate these tumultuous activities, but also to have influence to demonstrate his exceptional significance. That's why he made up a story about a bribe of 10 million hryvnias, which was allegedly offered to him by a man when Saakashvili was running in the morning at the Botanical Garden. I laughed. Really? Why should anybody give you a bribe, David? You can't do anything and you don't influence anything. In any event, the case was instituted on his application. Or probably, it was closed a long time ago because there was no evidence of this fact. Soon, Petro Poroshenko asked me to load David to invent for him some special area of work. I already had plans to set up a general inspector to oversee the GPU's internal security and fight corruption in the department. I appointed a professional guy as the head, and I entrusted David Saakashvili to supervise the work of the inspection. It was a serious structure with significant operational capabilities, access to some materials that an ordinary prosecutor does not have. The inspectorate could use the databases of the SBU and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It was not long before we started to identify and detain dishonest prosecutors in the GPU. There were court verdicts in these cases, although Saakashvili had nothing to do with it. I did not come to a working relationship with David. It could not come because I didn't see his real value, especially after Saakashvili overwhelmed the organization of testing for the recruitment of local prosecutors. Then I came up with an idea, with which everyone gladly agreed. The prosecutor of the Odessa region, Roman Govda, would return to Kyiv as my deputy and David would take his place, but still retaining the position of deputy for reforms. For David, this option seemed comfortable, and not only because the local state administration was headed by his friend Mikhail Saakashvili. In September, we found out that the funds allocated by the U.S. government for the preparation of tests for the competition for local prosecutors had disappeared. Moreover, millions of dollars to reform the prosecutor's office, too. However, I will tell you about everything in order. The new law on the prosecutor's office allows for the comprehensive reform of the system of prosecutors' offices, including testing and open recruitment of candidates. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. For local prosecutors, I instructed Saakashvili to develop test tasks and software for the qualifying exam. The tests were to be ready by August 15, 2015. The U.S. government has allocated significant funds for its preparation at the expense of taxpayers. Variants of test tasks, which allegedly developed Saakashvili and company, sent for examination to the National Academy of the Prosecutor's Office were shocking. 1,171 out of 5,235 tasks, almost a third, contained significant errors. Among the questions rejected by experts were surprising. For example, what is the distance from Tbilisi to Moscow? It seems that Saakashvili and company took a questionnaire tested in Georgia, reworked it a bit, translated it to Ukrainian, and presented it as their own intellectual product. Of course, the Academy returned the test for revision, but a month later, after receiving an updated version, it concluded that these defects had not been corrected, or not corrected in a satisfactory manner. Despite the fact that the test tasks were not approved via professional examination, Saakashvili posted them on the GPU website and, it should be understood, reported to the donors as work completed. General Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine National, Academy of Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine, to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine VM Shokin 15. Dear Viktor Nikolaevich, the National Academy of the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine carried out a scientific expert assessment of test tasks and model cases developed for prosecutors in order to identify knowledge of the legal framework. Expert assessment was conducted in accordance with the developed recommendations for expert assessment of test tasks for knowledge of the legal framework. According to the results of the scientific assessment, the National Academy of the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine proposes to make changes, additions, clarifications, replacements, etc. to 1,171 texts out of 5,235 texts, and up to 42 of the 56 submitted model cases. Detailed results of the expert assessment are presented in the generalized information on the quality of test tasks, which is attached. The National Academy of the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine is ready to continue to join the work on the examination of test and case tasks after the developers eliminate the comments, as well as provide any other scientific, methodological, organizational assistance in this matter. Sincerely, Rector Oleg Litvak. Report of the Rector of the National Academy of the Prosecutor's Office on the examination of test tasks prepared under the leadership of D. Saakashvili, May 15, 2015. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Prosecutors on social networks were angry and laughing. However, we could not announce the competition without a professional package of theoretical and practical tasks. Therefore, specialists from the National Academy of Prosecutors have subsequently developed new tests. As it turned out later, not everything went well with the testing software. In particular, with its developer, PJSC Finport Technologies, Inc., contracts were not properly assigned. At the end of the financial year, the GPU accountant submitted a report to me, in which he emphasized that the funds for the tests did not come via our accounts. We started an official investigation as we raced to understand. Representatives of the organizations to which the Georgian reformer instructed to develop tests, the EU Project Support to Justice Reforms in Ukraine, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, said that they only partially participated in the development of the tests, but they could not reach an agreement and were unable to perform the actual works. Therefore, it was not possible to identify the test developer. However, this meaningful episode is not. Chapter 10, Georgian paratrooper from Biden, Saakashvili, and the mixing millions of dollars for reform. Les Embassy in Ukraine, statement by Charge Detectives B. That's why the off. Source Charge d'Affaires Bruce Donahue, prosecutors. Limited to the story of the money that the U.S. government directed to the reform of law enforcement agencies in Ukraine, and which may well have disappeared in the pockets of Georgian comrades and Ukrainian grant-eaters greater than less than. In the summer of 2015, the U.S. Embassy website reported that the U.S. government was allocating $2 million to the GPU and even approved a reform action plan signed by 2016 P1. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Deputy Attorney General David Saakashvili and Ambassador Payet. David shared this good news on his own Facebook page. It is unclear why he did not inform the leadership of the GPU. During an investigation launched in March of the following year, Saakashvili had denied signing such a framework document and could not explain why he was spreading information about $2 million in U.S. aid on social media. As it turned out, this amount was indeed allocated in the framework of international technical assistance for the project support to criminal justice reforms in Ukraine. The donor is U.S. government, the recipients, GPU, and attention. Odessa Regional State Administration, the Center for Combating Corruption, and other public organizations. In what way is the regional administration headed by Saakashvili so important to the reform of law enforcement agencies, and why it was Odessa and not another region of Ukraine that received such favor from the U.S. government? American taxpayers should probably think about these issues, as well as why the NGO Center for Combating Corruption receives funds for the reform of public authorities while having nothing to do with this work. In addition, during 2014 to 2016, the U.S. government provided $4,436,129 in assistance for recruitment, including the development of special tests for the Ukrainian Prosecutor's Office. Recipients in the agreement were specified as the GPU and, again, attention, Odessa Regional State Administration. In 2013 to 2016, the European Union allocated a significant amount, €8,547,885, to the project support to justice reform in Ukraine, which was to involve the Ministry of Justice and the GPU. However, our department did not receive a single penny either under this project or any of the above. In March 2016, all these facts, including Saakashvili's involvement in the disappearance of funds allocated for the reform of the prosecutor's office, formed the basis of criminal proceedings. The case was opened by the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Acting Prosecutor General Yuri Severuk, I was on vacation at that time. Annoyed, Petro Poroshenko immediately called, "What are you doing on vacation? Close the case." Biden is angry. But how? I asked. Does Biden know? Saakashvili told him. I regret that our investigators did not have time to conduct a full investigation. It is unknown to whom we would come. Of course, no one can be blamed without facts, but I dare to make a personal assumption. I do not doubt that part of the money of American taxpayers was ripped off by Georgian reformers and grant organizations here in Ukraine, and some probably did not even go beyond USA. Yuri Lutsenko, 19 days after his appointment to the post of General Prosecutor of Ukraine on May 31st, without having carried out all the necessary investigative actions, put an end to these proceedings. In 2020, the People's Deputy of Ukraine, Andriy Derkach, appealed to Prosecutor General with a statement about the initiation of criminal proceedings. People's Deputy of Ukraine, no, from April 14th, 2020, Office of the Attorney General. Kiev, street difference, 13/15, statement on the commission of a criminal offense in accordance with Part 1 of Article 214 of the CPC of Ukraine. According to the information I received on February 7th, 2020, within the framework of the project support to the reform of criminal justice of Ukraine, and on behalf of the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, 449 kilograms of attestation materials of prosecutors and investigators of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine were destroyed. According to investigative journalists, the destruction of documents was committed intentionally, just at the time when the Prosecutor General, Ryaboshabka, RG, and his team already knew that there were 250 votes in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine for his resignation. In addition, according to publicly available information, namely the response of the Office of the Prosecutor General Edition 1, the Organization of Recertification of Prosecutors was carried out by Statistics Ukraine LLC, which was declared a company that measured psychological and other characteristics of prosecutors. That is, the then Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine had an agreement on the implementation of international technical assistance programs by the International Development Law Organization hereinafter IDLO, headed by its head Levan Duchidze, registered at Viale Vaticano 106, Rome, Italia, IDLO, in turn, entered into an agreement with Cimerix, Ukraine LLC, as the actual executor of RE certification. At the same time, it was established that Cimerix Ukraine LLC, founded in 2018, has not conducted any activity so far and has never filed tax returns. Moreover, during testing in October 2019, the company changed ownership. Thus, instead of the couple of psychologists who founded this company, its owner became a person whose main type is retail outside stores. Addition 2. Based on the above and the risk criteria, investigators are convinced that there is every reason to consider the company Cimerix. Ukraine is a company created for a single task, which in practice was used as a tool for the withdrawal of U.S. logistics. Statements submitted by People's Deputy A. Derkach to the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine on the facts of embezzlement of US financial assistance for the reform of the GPU, April 14, 2020, P1. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. In addition, it was established that Cimerix Ukraine LLC has foreign currency accounts with Raiffeisen Bank Aval, which must be transferred during the pretrial investigation into the theft of international technical assistance. In accordance with the procurement plan, USD 7,384,192 has been allocated for the reform of the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine, of which the total maximum amount of international technical assistance that can be used to purchase goods, works, and services with international technical assistance under the program is $744,000. USA. After analyzing the procurement plan, we can conclude that hundreds of thousands of US dollars of American taxpayers' money were fraudulently misappropriated by a representative of IDLO in Ukraine under the veiled purchase of goods, catering, travel, information services, etc., including through companies such as Cimerix Ukraine. This is not the first time that the issue of fraud and misuse of funds with the program support to the reform of criminal justice in Ukraine, which is implemented by IDLO. Thus, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, initiated a criminal case on the theft of international technical assistance funds allocated for this program. For reference, it should be noted that the IDLO has repeatedly been a participant in international scandals. In 2013, Afghan law enforcement agencies investigated the activities Ofidblun Mamai use of funds issued by
The State Department the amount to $7.8 million.
In addition, the former Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, in addition to investigating high-profile criminal proceedings against Burisma Group, one of whose board members was Gunter Biden, and criminal proceedings concerning the withdrawal and legalization of so-called Yanukovych family funds with the help of the American company Franklin Templeton, and machinations with domestic foreign government bonds. Edition 4. Pre-trial criminal proceedings were conducted for embezzlement of international technical assistance involving so-called anti-corruption activists who had personal relations with the law enforcement department at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine and under personal guardianship. Charge d'affaires of Ukraine, George Kent. This is evidenced in particular by the official letter of George Kent, who actually obstructed the lawful activities of law enforcement to investigate the theft of money from American taxpayers. Appendix 5. The letter dated April 4, 2016 reads, "The U.S. assistance package, which the Prosecutor General's office has publicly stated is investigating, is being implemented through the International Law Development Organization, an intergovernmental organization, and the Department for International Development, Cooperation and Training of Prosecutors of Justice of the United States." Statements submitted by People's Deputy A. Derkach to the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine on the facts of embezzlement of US financial assistance for the reform of the GPU, April 14, 2020, P2. Funding is managed and overseen by the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv through the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Division. Our view of the donor who assisted in investigating its use. In view of the above, we reject the allegation that Mr. Sakvarlitsa or any of the employees of the Prosecutor General's office with whom we worked could have used these funds for other purposes, as long as they were not under their control. Investigating the actions of the Anti-Corruption Center in relation to the assistance they received from us is also inappropriate. In fact, in that letter, George Kent covered up a scheme to embezzle funds from American taxpayers and illegally interfered in the activities of the Ukrainian law enforcement agency. And given that George Kent is now an employee of the U.S. State Department, and the organization IDLO is still performing the function of mastering American funds, there is reason to believe that George Kent is actively contributing to illegal actions to continue misuse and money laundering through the organization IDLO and Cimerix Ukraine. The above letter to the GPU was signed by George Kent exactly the day after the resignation of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin. According to investigative journalist, George Kent and his actions synchronized with U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden on the pressure on Shokin and his subsequent release. According to Ukrainian investigators with the Prosecutor General's office, who were investigating criminal cases against Burisma, the motive in Joseph Biden's actions was to stop criminal cases against Burisma, in which his son, Gunter Biden, held a senior position. Another motive of Joseph Biden, with the help of George Kent, was to establish control over the union with the most profitable area in the country, oil and gas. Thus, in the supervisory board of the largest national company of Ukraine, the leading enterprise of the fuel and energy complex, the largest taxpayer, the group Naftogaz of Ukraine, the majority are foreign citizens. However, one of them needs special attention, namely Amos Hochstein, as one of the main architector of Naftogaz's reforms, and in fact, co-author, together with Andrei Kobylev and Andrei Favorov, of the enrichment scheme on the reverse of Russian gas, which was presented as a European supply, which is corrupt. According to experts, amounted to at least $1.5 billion. USA, Edition 6. Amos Hochstein himself is a leading expert in the U.S. State Department on the Democratic Party of Energy. As the chief energy diplomat of the United States, Hochstein worked closely with D. Baden and collaborated with him on international trips to promote energy resources as a new tool in U.S. policy. Statements submitted by People's Deputy A. Derkach to the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine on the facts of embezzlement of US financial assistance for the reform of the GPU, April 14, 2020, P3. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. The investigation by the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine against Burisma, as well as the management of Naftogaz of Ukraine, which was actually run by Amos Hochstein, made it impossible to implement the Biden family's further plans in Ukraine's energy sector. In particular, Joe Biden pressured the Ukrainian authorities to dismiss Shokin. As for George Kent's motives, investigative journalists have every reason to believe that the main one is that George Kent, as U.S. charge d'affaires in Ukraine, personally contributed to Joe Biden's initiatives and actions and to the so-called corruption and money laundering, misuse of American taxpayers' funds, which Ukraine received in the form of material and technical assistance. Also, according to journalistic investigations and publicly available information, he publicly participated in the harassment of Ukrainian official Roman Nasyrov, the only Ukrainian official to attend the inauguration of the U.S. president, and personally led the pocket activists under the court, under the time of choosing a measure of restraint for Roman Nasyrov. George Kent also personally oversaw the establishment and operation of NABU, which in fact interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, publishing unconfirmed information about the head of Trump's election headquarters, Paul Manafort, and synchronizing his actions with journalists and MPs in the illegal dissemination of data. The result was the resignation of Paul Manafort as Trump's campaign manager in August 2016, Appendix 7. Abu, as is known from the documents posted on the NABU Leaks website, illegally collected personal data of Prosecutor General Shokin and his family and transferred them to the U.S. Embassy, where George Kent was the U.S. charge d'affaires in Ukraine at the time. Thus, in the actions of representatives of IDLO in Ukraine and the company Symmetrics Ukraine, there is a criminal offense, a crime, under Part 5 of Article 190, 1 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, i.e. misappropriation of international technical assistance provided to Ukraine, Part 3 of Article 212 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, i.e. tax evasion in especially large amounts. And based on the fact that the funds misappropriated through the criminal scheme are U.S. taxpayers, I ask in the framework of international cooperation to apply to the U.S. Department of Justice regarding the need to verify the actions of George Kent and unidentified persons of the U.S. Embassy's Law Enforcement Department, implementation of the program, support to the reform of criminal justice in Ukraine, and the development of material and technical assistance, in accordance with the requirements of Part 1, Part 4 of Art. 214 of the Criminal Procedure Code of Ukraine, hereinafter CPC of Ukraine investigator, prosecutor immediately, but not later than 24 hours after filing an application. Notification of a criminal offense must enter the relevant information in the Unified Register of Pre-Trial Investigations and initiate. Statements submitted by People's Deputy A. Derkach to the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine on the facts of embezzlement of US financial assistance for the reform of the GPU, April 14, 2020, P. 4. Initiate investigations. Refusal to accept and register an application or notification of a criminal offense is not allowed. In addition, according to paragraph 1, part 1 of Article 303 of the CPC of Ukraine, the inaction of the investigator, prosecutor, which consists in not entering information about the criminal offense in the Unified Register of Pretrial Investigations after receiving the application and notification of the criminal offense, may be appealed to the investigating judge. In view of the above, guided by Art of the Criminal Procedure Code of Ukraine, required 1. No later than 24 hours after the submission of this statement on the committed criminal offense, to enter the relevant information in the Unified Register of Pretrial Investigations and to initiate a pretrial investigation in order to establish the objective circumstances of the case and bring the perpetrators to justice. 2. Notify me of the results of consideration of the notification of a criminal offense within the time limits prescribed by law. 3. Take personal control of the pretrial investigation. Addition 4. A copy of the response of the Prosecutor General's office to one sheet. 5. Certificate LLC Symmetrics, Ukraine on one sheet. 6. A copy of the plan for the purchase of goods, works, and services purchased with international technical assistance on 3 sheets. 7. Proceedings of the press conference of People's Deputies of Ukraine, Derkach Al and Dubinsky OA from November 20th, 2019 on 29 sheets. 8. A copy of George Kent's letter to the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, together with a translation on 3 sheets. 9. Proceedings of the press conference of the People's Deputy of Ukraine, Derkach Al, from December 17, 2019, on 70 sheets. Statements submitted by People's Deputy Derkach to the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine on the facts of embezzlement of US financial assistance for the reform of the GPU, April 14, 2020, P5, Chapter 11. On the verge of life and death, poisoning in Greece. Greek doctors were the first who saved my life, 2019. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. At first, there was harassment in the media and rhetoric about the corrupted Shokin. Let me remind you that even U.S. Vice President Biden did not dig up any compromising material on me. When attempts to discredit and prosecute failed, they tried to remove me. It was in the style of the Kiev bandits of the 90s, whose black humor testified that the best witness is a dead witness. In 2019, I was poisoned with mercury. My body's mercury levels were almost 5 times higher than normal. My heart stopped twice, and I miraculously survived. I learned to walk and talk again. Perhaps in order to tell this story. On September 8th, 2019, I flew on vacation to Greece to the island of Crete. On September 10th, I went to the Rethinoa with my Greek friend, Thomas Kyriakidis. A friend was behind the wheel. We stopped for coffee. I felt sick. I got out of the car and fell. The metaphor of falling like a dead man will not be an exaggeration, because I came to my senses in the hospital. As doctors declared later, they recorded 2 cardiac stops. They used a defibrillator and brought me back to this world. They say I must have been born wearing a shirt because a few minutes of procrastination would have been fatal. Thank God my friend was not a tourist, but a local Greek, and he took me directly to the hospital. I spent 5 days in intensive care in Rethymno. The local doctors were puzzled by the inability to diagnose high blood pressure, increased potassium in the blood, decreased kidney function. However, all the symptoms they recorded did not give a complete picture of my disease and its nature. The condition was so critical that I was transferred to the intensive care unit of the main hospital in Heraklion. During the next 3 days, the local doctors also could not understand the causes of my illness. On September 20th, half alive, I was discharged from a hospital in Heraklion. Friends helped me to get to Kiev. However, my health became worse. So at the beginning of October, I decided to undergo a thorough examination and treatment at the Rudolf Innerhaus Clinic in Vienna. I was cared for by Mykola Korpan, the same doctor who put Viktor Yushchenko on his feet after he was poisoned in 2004 during the presidential campaign. Here's how he said about what happened to me. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. You stated that the mercury contended to several heart attacks in Viktor Shokin and further problems with his health. How much mercury was in Shokin's body? When Viktor Shokin approached us, the level of mercury was 0.7 units in his blood, and the allowable dosis zero, anthemaxium upper limitis. That is almost 5 times higher than the permissible level of mercury in blood. 9.7 isolethal dose. That there was a decrease as there was intensive treatment. The decrease was down to 8 and then to 7, and soon the last recorded level of mercury in Shokin's blood is approaching the upper limit of normal, but still it exceeds sitwise despite the fact that intensive care. Did Shokin's poisoning lead to any consequences? Shokin had 3 heart attacks. And you know, in history such things only happen, Theons. It was a miracle case. But Shokin survived and emerged from this deadly situation due to 2 main factors. The first factor is that he was an athlete in the past. His body was healthy, his heart muscle was working, his liver and kidneys were working. And the second, doctors intervened in time. Could mercury enter the body naturally or thome? Such a high level of mercury in the blood, which is a lethal dose set of human body, it can only be obtained artificially. In what way and under what circumstances this mercury was introduced into his body, I cannot say. He could get that dasi in a day, he could get it in a week, and he could get, say, breathing mercury vapor for a month. It can be in any enclosed space, for example, in a room, bedroom, office, car, and receive this dose of mercury gradually it accumulated. Then the deadly maximum dose of mercury reached. It speak, and we see it in the heart muscle, which then cannot stand. Source: after conducting dozens of complex tests, Viennese experts concluded that the cause of the mysterious disease is mercury. The concentration of mercury was mg liter. The norm for the human body is not higher than 2 milligrams L. This certainly testified to an attempted assassination. Toxicologists, with whom I spoke later, stated that, unfortunately, it is impossible to establish how long ago and in what way mercury got into the body. It could have happened 3 days or 2 months ago, with drinks or food. However, experts had no doubt that this did not happen naturally. I have been returned to life in a month at Rudolf Innerhaus. The blow to the body was very powerful. These were not days of rest and relaxation. To make the reader understand, I will only say that the drip started at 9 o'clock in the morning and ended at 9 o'clock in the evening. I was laying there and just thinking. Thoughts still led to one person. I have no evidence that Joseph Biden initiated this fortunately failed assassination. However, I rule out that heavy metal poisoning could have been arranged by anyone else, because I have no obvious enemies who would be interested in my death. Instead, the fact is that it is Biden who is vindictively persecuting me over the Burisma case. In any case, the investigation must confirm or refute my assumptions. When I returned to Kyiv, I filed a complaint through my lawyer and with the Rethymno. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. November 4th, 2019, the results of laboratory studies confirming the presence of excessive levels of mercury in the body of V. Shokin. Police, and on November 12, 2019, Greek law enforcement officers opened a case of poisoning, treating it as an attempt on my life. The investigation is ongoing. On the beginning of 2020, Greek investigators sent a request to Ukraine for international legal assistance in this criminal case. According to this international order, Ukrainian law enforcement officers were to interrogate me here in Kyiv as a victim, as well as provide an opportunity to attach any documents and interrogate any persons I would point to. During a 1.5-hour interrogation conducted on June 16, 2020, by an investigator on particularly important cases of the investigative department of the capital's national police. I recounted everything that happened to me in Greece and then in the Viennese hospital, providing many medical certificates and other documents. I also petitioned the Greek law enforcement authorities to interrogate Joseph Biden, John Kerry, and others, who I believe may be involved in the case. As I write these lines, 3 months have passed since that interrogation. However, our investigators were not in a hurry to send the received materials to their Greek colleagues, and the true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. I understand the reason for such an unmotivated delay. Apparently, they have been instructed by senior management to put the brakes on, because if the Greek police receive this evidence, they will immediately send a request to the United States to interrogate Biden and Kerry, so the case will become internationally known. And the current Ukrainian government does not seem interested in this investigation. Chronology of the struggle. Of the average citizen of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, with international corruption, in the person of former U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden, who is under the careful care of the Ukrainian authorities. This study and its analysis document clearly demonstrate how the Constitution and laws of Ukraine are violated and national court decisions are not enforced. In connection with the above, Ukraine's deliberate interference in the U.S. presidential election in 2020 is particularly clear. I note that the following circumstances and conclusions are documented. Then we begin. On January 28, 2020, Viktor Shokin officially addressed the State Bureau of Investigation of Ukraine, SBI, with a statement about the crime committed against him by former U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden. In his statement, Shokin VM pointed out the circumstances of the crime and the fact that this crime was committed against him by Joseph Biden. This application was received and registered with the SBI on January 28, 2020. In accordance with the requirements of Article 214 of the Criminal Procedure Code of Ukraine, hereinafter CPC of Ukraine SBI had to immediately, but not later than within 24 hours, enter in the Unified Register of Pre-Trial Investigations hereinafter IRPI information set forth in the statement. 220. The true stories about Verteiden's interminable corruption in Shokin VM on the facts of committing a criminal offense. In other words, to open criminal proceedings against Joseph Biden under Part 2 of Article 343 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, hereinafter the Criminal Code of Ukraine, for his direct interference in the activities of Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin. SBI officials were well aware of their responsibilities for entering data from Viktor Shokin's statement into the IRPI, but nevertheless deliberately illegally failed to comply with the above-mentioned requirements of the procedural law by sending VM, Shokin's statement, to the National Police of Ukraine. In turn, the main investigation department of the National Police of Ukraine returned the statement about the crime to the SBI, also without registration with the IRPI. Then, without making a decision on the merits of the application, the SBI, trying to further hide it from registration, sent this appeal to the territorial department of the SBI in Kyiv, where it remained without processing for a long time. On February 6, 2020, the investigating judge of the Petrivka District Court of Kyiv ruled that the complaint of the representative VM, Shokin, was satisfied to the inaction of investigators and obliged authorized SBI officials to immediately enter information about this crime in the IRPI and initiate a pretrial investigation. The mentioned court decision, which came into force, was immediately sent by the investigating judge to the SBI for execution. At the same time, SBI investigators, Chapter 11, on the verge of life and death. Palming in Greece intentionally violated the requirements of Art. 1291 of the Constitution of Ukraine. Art. CPC of Ukraine flatly refused to comply with this court decision. In this regard, Viktor Shokin on February 20th, 2020, appealed to the Office of the Prosecutor General with a statement that they committed a serious crime under Part 3 of Art. 382 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. Consistent in its blatant disregard for the requirements of Ukrainian law, the prosecutor's office refused to respond to this statement as well. So Viktor Shokin was forced to appeal again to the court, which ordered the Prosecutor General's office on April 14th, 2020 to initiate and investigate the SBI criminal proceedings for intentional non-execution of a court decision that has entered into force. In violation of the requirements of Art. 214 of the Criminal Procedure Code of Ukraine, the Office of the Prosecutor General delayed the execution of this court decision for a month and entered the relevant information into the IRPI only on May 20th, 2020. The investigation of this case is not progressing at the moment. Meanwhile, the court decision of June 2nd, 2020 on the need to initiate criminal proceedings on the fact of Joe Biden's interference in the activities of prosecutor General Shokin VM was partially performed only on February 24th, 2020. The SBI investigator entered the IRPI with information about the crime against Viktor Shokin, but intentionally, knowingly, and purposefully noted that it was committed by an abstract U.S. citizen, and not specifically by Joe Biden. Such criminal selectivity in the behavior of SBI officials is a clear indication of their bias and desire to less than remove illegally Joe Biden from criminal. 222. The true stories about Verteiden's interminable corruption in proceedings, despite a number of complaints addressed to the heads of the SBI and to the Office of the Prosecutor General, demanding that the court's decision be complied with in full. This did not happen, and the appeals were left without proper attention and consideration. Viktor Shokin was once again forced to appeal to the court with a complaint about the illegal failure to enter all the data of his statement about the crime into the IRPI. Having considered this complaint, the investigating judge of the Petrivka District Court of Kyiv on April 21st, 2020, ruled on satisfaction. The operative part of this judgment states, 1. Satisfy the complaint in the interests of Viktor Shokin. 2. To oblige the competent person of the Office of the Prosecutor General, who provides procedural guidance in this criminal proceeding, to submit to the IRPI a summary of the facts that may indicate the commission of a criminal offense under Part 2 of Art. 343 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. Information about interference in the activities of the former Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Shokin VM. It is a citizen of the United States of America, Joseph Biden, former Vice President of the United States. On April 29, 2020, the said decision was sent by the court for execution to the Office of the Prosecutor General. For today, September 2020, this judgment, which has entered into force, despite numerous petitions and complaints addressed to prosecutors at all levels, they have not been complied with. Thus, Ukrainian law enforcement officers, at the cost of gross violation of procedural law, as well as intentional non-compliance with the court decision, chose the position of neglecting the legal rights and interests of Ukrainian citizen Shokin VM, former prosecutor general, covering the criminal actions of U.S. citizen Joe Biden, former vice president interfering in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. In view of the above, Victor Shokin filed a complaint with the court, which by its decision of July 24, 2020, ordered the SBI to initiate and investigate the relevant criminal proceedings against officials of the prosecutor general's office for non-compliance with the court decision on the need to amend the summary of facts, the circumstances of the criminal proceedings, and thus cover up the wrongful conduct of a particular person, Joe Biden. Thus, from January 28, 2020, when Shokin VM, Victor Shokin's representative repeatedly appealed to SBI investigators and prosecutors of the Attorney General's office, as well as personally to the heads of these law enforcement agencies with requests for his interrogation as a victim. At the same time, none of the appeals was granted. Moreover, on March 2, 2020, the SBI investigator issued a decision to refuse Shokin VM in recognition of his victim. In his procedural decision, the investigator cynically noted that the dismissal of Victor Shokin from the post of Prosecutor General of Ukraine, due to the influence of Joe Biden, in his opinion, did not cause Shokin VM any damage, moral or material. After appealing this unfounded procedural decision of the SBI to the court, on April 7, 2020, Victor Shokin received a decision declaring VI investigator's decision illegal and revoking it. Thus, 224. The true stories about for Titan's international corruption in. 4 months ago, the investigator and the prosecutor had an obligation established by the criminal procedure law confirmed by a court decision to recognize Shokin VM as a victim and interrogate him. However, this has not been done to date. Our Ukrainian law enforcement officers carefully protects Joe Biden from any negativity that is reasonably and legally supposed to carry out the specified criminal proceedings for him, which interferes to the elections in the United States in 2020, during the entire existence of the criminal proceedings. The investigator or prosecutor never summoned Victor Shokin for questioning in any status, not even as a witness, although he can cite facts and circumstances that indicate the validity of his statement that Joe Biden had committed a crime. Obviously, the investigator and the prosecutor understand this and are now successfully, under the direct instruction of their supervisors, making sure that this information is not documented in the manner prescribed by procedural law. Victor Shokin also appealed to the investigator and the prosecutor to commit cases and other procedural actions, but apparently they were given a clear task not to investigate this criminal case, not to establish the real circumstances of the case, so they openly block and ignore these initiatives towards its strategic goal of covering up this criminal case. The Prosecutor General's office in early April made a procedural decision to send it for further investigation by the SRI to the Investigative Department of the State National Security Service in Kyiv. As of August 2020, the proceedings are considered by the said pre-trial investigation body, but in fact remain without Pixie, as it is required to the prosecutor's office, where he was under careful guardianships and control to ensure that no investigative action is conducted. According to the Kyiv City Prosecutor's Office, the criminal proceedings have been under investigation in the Prosecutor General's office for more than 2 months and are not being returned for further investigation. In view of the above, none of the motions filed by the investigative representative of the victim Shokin VM as early as April not yet considered. At the same time, in accordance with the requirements of Article 220 of the CPC of Ukraine, such applications must be considered within no more than 3 days. They have not been considered for 3 months. In general, in these criminal proceedings, the investigator and the prosecutor did not carry out any investigative or other procedural action as a result of their intentional, concerted, and purposeful conduct. Until now, only courts have made legal decisions in these criminal proceedings, but most of them have not been implemented. On May 12, 2020, Victor Shokin's representative, lawyer Oleksandr Teleshetsky, at a briefing in the Interfax Ukraine news agency, reported about gross violation of the law during the investigation of this criminal proceeding. These violations, in particular, include failure, 226, the true stories about for Titan's international corruption in, to comply with reasonable pretrial investigations, neglect of procedural rights of the victim, non-compliance with a number of court decisions of national courts, which have entered into force and are binding on Wysieks in Ukraine. On the same day, Shokin VM addressed an open letter to the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, in which he asked him personally as the guarantor of the Constitution of Ukraine to immediately deal with the facts of lawlessness and non-execution of court decisions to ensure the prosecution of perpetrators and to take measures to restore his legal rights. Until now, Shokin VM did not receive an answer. For the time being, the question remains who and when will be held responsible for intentional non-compliance with the above-mentioned decisions of Ukrainian courts, violation of the Constitution and laws of Ukraine in the interests of U.S. citizen Joseph Biden and against the interests of Ukrainian citizen Victor Shokin. And will the Ukrainian authorities finally understand that the investigation of this criminal case is a kind of test of its political maturity and professional suitability directly related to its authority, and will undoubtedly become a sign of political disengagement in the U.S. election process in 2020. Chapter 12. The struggle continues. Epilogue for the future. Victor Shokin. The struggle continues. 2020. 231. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Last year, my messages, statements, complaints, as well as letters to the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, have been circulating. When finishing this book, it has been 8 months since I applied to the State Bureau of Investigation to register a criminal offense against me under Article 343 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, This article provides for criminal penalties for interfering in the activities of a law enforcement officer. This is exactly what Joseph Biden did. However, investigators and the prosecutor categorically do not want to record in the criminal proceedings the information about crimes that I know and am ready to provide to the investigation. By law, SBI investigators were obliged to provide the IRPI Unified Register of Pretrial Investigations, ED, with comprehensive information on the circumstances of this crime, to recognize me as a victim, to interrogate me, and so on. Unfortunately, none of this was done. During the entire existence of the criminal proceedings, the investigator or prosecutor never tried to summon me for questioning in any status, even as a witness. For more than 8 months, SBI investigators and prosecutors have not conducted any investigative or other proceedings in this criminal case. Moreover, on March 2nd, the investigator managed to issue a decision refusing to recognize me as a victim. On April 7th, I appealed this decision, and the court overturned it. So what? The court decision has not been executed yet. I have repeatedly appealed not only to the SBI investigators, the National Police, the prosecutors of the Prosecutor General's office, and the heads of law enforcement agencies to provide me with the opportunity to testify as a victim in this case. None of my legal issues were satisfied. On May 12, 2020, I wrote a letter to the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, asking him to personally understand this lawlessness and, as the guarantor of the Constitution, influence the restoration of my legal rights. But so far, I have not received an answer on the merits of my letter of appeal. The irony of fate is that the SBI is exactly the law enforcement agency in the creation of which I was directly involved. Instead, another new law enforcement agency, which I also facilitated, the National. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, conducted operational and investigative activities against me. To the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky. Shokin Viktor Nikolaevich, Kyiv, Street Saksaganskogo 122B, Office 22. Dear Mr. President, me, Shokin Viktor Nikolaevich, citizen of Ukraine, not convicted, not in the register of corrupt officials, honored lawyer of Ukraine, honorary employee of the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine, Prosecutor General of Ukraine in 2015 to 2016, repeatedly Deputy Prosecutor General of Ukraine, I appeal to you as a guarantor of compliance Constitution of Ukraine, human and civil rights and freedoms. Today, May 12, 2020, my representative, during a press conference held at the Interfax Ukraine news agency, reported on the facts of gross violation of the law in the investigation of criminal proceedings on my allegations of several criminal offenses against me. These offenses in particular are a violation of reasonable pretrial investigation, neglect of my procedural rights as a victim, non-compliance with a number of court decisions of national courts, which have entered into force and are binding on all in Ukraine. Prolonged improper investigation of these criminal proceedings shows signs of purposeful, coordinated, appropriate behavior of individual law enforcement officers of the state, which grossly violates my legal rights and interests and harms the international prestige of Ukraine. In view of the above, I ask you personally, as the guarantor of the Constitution of Ukraine, to immediately deal with the facts of lawlessness and non-enforcement of court decisions against me. Ensure the prosecution of current persons and take measures to restore my legal rights. Sincerely, Viktor Shokin. December 5th, 2020. An open letter to the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, about the facts of lawlessness, failure to investigate criminal proceedings and non-execution of court decisions on lawsuits filed by V. Shokin, May 12th, 2020. For several months, my lawyer, Alexander Teleshetsky, and I tried to get an answer from NABU on what grounds were those actions initiated, and only recently received a letter of resignation from the Bureau. They say OSA, operatively search activity, was terminated for lack of corpus delicti. After reading this reply, I laughed unhappily. Even Joe Biden, the second most influential official in one of the most powerful countries in the world in 2016, did not find compromising information against me. They could not find it because it did not exist. I committed no corruption. In my opinion, a former colleague from the Prosecutor General's office, Yuri Severuk, aptly said in an interview with journalists, at first, it was stated that Shokin was a corrupt official, not confirmed. Then, which contributes to corruption, not confirmed. Then, that does not fight corruption. This has not been confirmed either. The statement to the SBI that I just talked about is just one episode of my struggle. And there is also the history of lawsuits against the illegal dismissal of me from the post of prosecutor. The true stories about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. General of Ukraine, which has been going on for 4 years now, but I am not going to give up. I have already written that on December 22nd, 2016, I asked the Supreme Administrative Court of Ukraine to declare illegal and revoke the decree of the President of Ukraine on my dismissal, as well as the resolution of the Verkhovna Rada approving my dismissal. Also on March 28th, 2017, I filed an application with the Supreme Court of Ukraine to consider the issue of reinstatement. However, the court unreasonably rejected my request. All my lawsuits in Ukraine were not considered by judges under the same pretext, as if the deadlines for going to court were missed, although this is not true. The domestic themis remains blind in the literal sense of the word, or one of the authorities deliberately closes her eyes. This version of events seems more likely to me. Thus, the then Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko opened criminal cases against the judge of the Administrative Court Valentin Moroz, who considered my lawsuit in 2017. This shows pressure on the court. I have decided to apply to the European Court of Human Rights, ECTHAR, an institution which seeks protection of rights and dignity when all domestic. Remedies have been exhausted in accordance with generally accepted principles of international law. I filed an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights with my lawyers on October 25th, 2017. In January 2018, ECTHAR replied that my claim had been received and accepted for consideration. Before that, I consulted a lot with lawyers and judges here in Ukraine, It turns out that Ukraine is one of the 4 countries, along with Russia, Georgia, and Turkey, whose citizens file the most lawsuits with the European Court of Human Rights. More than 8,000 lawsuits filed by Ukrainian citizens against Ukraine have been registered. Namely, such cases are considered by this court the citizen against the country. In this case, I am also against a high-ranking official of another country, former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden. My lawsuit consists of 3 parts. In the first, I claim that President Petro Poroshenko fired me under pressure from Joe Biden. The second part is the facts about the button pressing of Verkhovna Rada deputies during the voting procedure for my resignation from the post of the Prosecutor General. Yes, the facts show that 4 deputies were not present in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine that day and did not vote, but the true story is about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine. Votes were counted for. One of them, Detro Sviatosh, wrote a notarized statement about this fact, which is attached to my claim to the ICTR. The third part of my appeal to the ICTR states that the Verkhovna Rada considered my resignation a month and a half after the submission. That is, there was a violation of the procedure provided for in the rules of procedure of the Verkhovna Rada. The resignation application must be considered within 2 weeks. The ICTR has never considered such a case before. It is not just a violation of human rights, European standards. The specificity of my case is that I, a citizen of Ukraine, am speaking in court against his state that at that time was under the external control of a representative of another state, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden. Why did I still dare to file a lawsuit in this respectable court? First of all, because there is a threat to my life. At one time, the XR considered the lawsuits of Yulia Tymoshenko and Yuri Lutsenko, which indicated a threat to their lives. Judge Volkova has a successful precedent recently. This ECTR decision is a pilot for Ukraine. The Volkov's case raised all the problems of the judicial system of Ukraine to the level of the ECTR in the recent period, as well as the violation of parliamentary procedure during the dismissal of this judge. A similar story is reflected in my lawsuit. In addition, the Vice President Biden was so afraid that I could give truthful testimony about him in the United States that in 2019, the U.S. Embassy deliberately blocked my visa to prevent my hypothetical communication with U.S. politicians and law enforcement, as mentioned earlier in this book. By the way, in 2019, the U.S. Embassy deliberately blocked my visa to prevent my hypothetical communication with U.S. politicians and law enforcement. Although, in fact, in 2019, I wanted to visit the United States at the invitation of my daughter, see my grandchildren, and did not even think to get involved in political processes. I will add that I have never been convicted and not included in the lists of corrupt officials. I do not understand what did not suit the U.S. Embassy in my visa application. And I have been to the United States 3 times before and received a visa without hindrance. We live in a new world, in chaos and threats. The true story is about Joe Biden's international corruption in Ukraine, of cataclysms. But I continue to believe in justice and the power of good. My mother taught me, never look for ways to hurt a person. It is so difficult for them. Seek how to be good to a person. I still try to live by this rule, so I react sharply to injustice and evil. My book is about crime and injustice, about the greed and dishonesty of politicians, about the political and business predation of Joe Biden. He put pressure on me, the president, and other leaders of Ukraine. My warring country needed help, and I was well aware of that, so I put the interests of the state above my own and wrote a letter of resignation. But the truth must be told, it was pressure and blackmail. World-class pressure and blackmail. I do not pursue any political goals. I want to debunk international corruption in the person of Joe Biden, and I am ready to lay down my life to restore justice. As a citizen, it hurts me that this politician has not yet been punished for crimes committed in Ukraine. That with the tacit consent of the elites in my country after the revolution of dignity and after thousands of casualties in the war in Donbass, a corrupt cancer has grown. I saw a lot of evil, and I know that justice will come. The main thing is that it does not happen too late. The President of the United States cannot be a person who does not respect the mother of another, and therefore his mother, and therefore the mothers of the whole world. A selfish, greedy, hypocritical person cannot be the President of the United States. And most important, the President of the United States, the leader of the democratic world, cannot be a person who does not respect and love the people of his country, other peoples, teaches them of international corruption. This is a problem not only for the United States and Ukraine, but for the whole world. I saw a lot of evil, and I know that justice will come. The main thing is that it come not too late. Autumn 2020. Citizen of the independent Ukraine, Victor Shokin. Notes.